Hey there, and welcome back. If the day has worn you thin and you are ready, at last, to set it down, then you have come to the right place. And you can let the rest of it fall away now. This is one of those nights for laying the present aside and letting the mind travel back across the centuries into an age of candlelight and ceremony, of noble families and long memories, far from the glare of your own time. Tonight I want to tell you the life of a woman whose name most people have never heard, and yet who stood, for a time, higher than almost any woman in England, and who is the ancestress of every king and queen this country has had since. She was born into one of the proudest families of Europe, and she married, at 17, a prince of England. And then she did something that scandalized a kingdom. Her name was Jacquetta of Luxembourg, and before the end of her life, she would be raised to the very summit of the court, and brought low and accused in her most defenceless hour of witchcraft, with small broken figures of lead laid out as the evidence against her. Let your shoulders drop. Let the bed take your weight. We have a whole life to travel tonight, from a castle in the old county of St. Pol to a quiet grave in England, and it is a stranger and a sadder and a more remarkable life than the histories usually trouble to tell. Before we begin, I would like to know where you are listening from tonight. The town, the country, whatever lies in the dark beyond your window as you settle in. Wherever you are, and whatever the hour shows on your side of the world, you are welcome here with me. If you find your way back to these evenings often, you are always welcome to subscribe so that the next one can find you when it comes. And if you ever care to leave a note below, I do look through them. And it is a quiet pleasure to know who has come to sit with me in the dark. There is no hurry in any of this. The story will keep, and so will I. Picture this: a great stone castle in the north of what we now call France, in the years when the long war between England and France had already been grinding on for generations. And a child is born into one of the oldest and grandest families of the continent. The year is somewhere near 1416, though the records of such things were not always kept with care, and the child is a girl, the eldest daughter of a count, and she is given the name Jacquetta. Her father is Peter of Luxembourg, Count of St. Pol and of Brienne and of Conversano, a man of vast lands and ancient blood, and her mother is a noblewoman of an Italian house. Margaret of Box, into this world of high lineage and wide estates, the small girl came, and from the very beginning she was a person of consequence, a daughter of one of the first families of Christendom, with a future that would be shaped, as the futures of such girls always were, by the needs and the ambitions of her house. The world into which Jacquetta was born was one already old in conflict, for the long struggle between the crowns of England and France. The war that later ages would call the 100 Years' War had been grinding on for the better part of a century by the time of her birth, and would grind on for decades more. It was a war that shaped everything in the lands of her childhood, the borderlands and the great fiefs of northern France and the Low Countries, where armies marched and towns changed hands, and the loyalties of mighty lords were courted and bought and broken. The noble families of these regions lived in the shadow of that war, choosing their sides, marrying for advantage, holding their castles against the turning of fortune, and the House of Luxembourg was deep in the heart of it, a power to be wooed by both the warring crowns. Into this long and dangerous contest, Jacquetta was born, and though she could not have known it in her cradle, the war would carry her, in time, across the sea to England, and to the strange destiny that waited for her there. We cannot fix the date of her birth with certainty, for the births of daughters, even the daughters of counts, were not always set down with the care given to the births of sons and heirs. And the year has to be reckoned backward from the things we do know. The best guess places it somewhere near the middle of the second decade of the 1400s, which would make her about 17 at the time of her first marriage, the age the records suggest. It is a small thing, this uncertainty about her birth, but it tells us something about the place of women, even at the summit of society, that the precise coming into the world of a grand lady could pass without a firm record, noticed by history only later, when she did the things that men thought worth the writing down. Jacquetta entered the world quietly, as far as the records are concerned, and only afterward did the chroniclers turn back to wonder when exactly the remarkable Duchess had been born. The name she was given, Jacquetta, is itself a small window into her world, a French form belonging to the noble naming of her region, and she shared the proud identity of a large and powerful family. She was the eldest daughter of her father, the Count, but she was not his only child, for the noble houses bred large families, and she had brothers and sisters who would themselves make marriages and careers across the noble world of the continent. Her kin held high places. The Luxembourgs of her generation included men who rose to be great churchmen and statesmen and soldiers, woven into the affairs of France and the Empire and the Low Countries. To be born among them was to be born into a wide and a powerful connection, a network of relatives who held lands and offices and influence across half of Western Europe. This great kinship mattered, for it was the web within which a noble life was lived, the source of alliance and advancement and identity. A girl of such a family did not stand alone, but as one of a wide connection, her marriage a thread in a vast fabric of family interest, her fortunes bound up with those of her brothers and her cousins and her house. When Jacquetta was later carried off to England and married there, she did not cease to be a Luxembourg, and her continental kin remained leading figures in their own world, so that she was always, even as an English duchess and an English knight's wife, a daughter of one of the first families of Europe, carrying that identity with her wherever her strange life took her. It is part of what made her such an extraordinary figure, this rooting in the high nobility of the continent, even as her life played out on the English stage. A noble lady of Jacquetta's standing possessed an identity and an authority that found expression in concrete things, and chief among them was her seal, the device pressed into wax to authenticate her letters and her grants. In an age before the signatures we know, the seal was the mark of a person's will and authority, and a lady of rank had her own, bearing the arms of her house and her dignity, by which she conducted her business and made her wishes law within her sphere. To hold a seal was to hold authority, the power to command and to grant and to bind. And Jacquetta, as Duchess and eminent lady, would have governed her affairs and her household and her estates through this instrument of her will, a woman of consequence acting in her own right. This is worth holding in mind against any notion that a noblewoman was merely a passive ornament, for within the wide sphere of her household and her lands a grand lady exercised real and daily authority. She gave orders that were obeyed, made grants that stood, dispensed patronage and charity, managed the complex business of a large establishment, and did it all with the force of her rank behind her. Jacquetta had been trained from girlhood in exactly this exercise of authority, and through the long years of her marriage and her widowhoods, she would have wielded it constantly, the mistress of households and estates, a woman whose word carried weight. The grand identity of the Luxembourg Duchess was not an abstraction, but a working power expressed in her seal and her letters and her command. The everyday authority of a grand lady in a world that, for all its constraints upon women, allowed those of the highest rank a real and a substantial sway. The family into which Jacquetta was born is worth pausing on, for the House of Luxembourg was no ordinary noble line, but one of the truly powerful families of medieval Europe, with a reach and a prestige that few could match. They were counts and dukes, and in their senior branches had worn crowns, for the Luxembourgs had given the Holy Roman Empire its emperors and had married into the highest houses of the continent. The branch from which Jacquetta came, the Counts of St. Pol, held great lands in the borderlands between France and the Low Countries, in a region fought over and prized, and they carried themselves as the equals of princes. To be born a daughter of this house was to be born into the very front rank of European nobility, with kinship ties that ran into half the courts of the West, and it gave Jacquetta, from her cradle, a standing and a sense of her own worth that would never leave her through all the strange turns her life would take. To grasp the height of the House of Luxembourg, we should understand that this was a family that had given crowned emperors to the Western world. In the generations before Jacquetta's birth, the heads of the senior Luxembourg line had been elected to rule the Holy Roman Empire, that vast and loose dominion of German and Central European lands that was, in name at least, the first secular power of Christendom. And they had been kings of Bohemia besides. The Luxembourgs had sat among the very greatest princes of Europe, had married their daughters to kings and their sons to the heiresses of great realms, and had carried their name into the highest councils of the age. Jacquetta's own branch, the Counts of St. Pol, was not the imperial line, but it shared in the prestige of the name and held vast power in its own right. With broad lands and a web of noble kinship that bound it to the first houses of France and the Low Countries. The family's reach into the affairs of the age can be seen in the careers of Jacquetta's own close kin, who stood at the centre of the events. In these very years, while the English held their conquests in France, members of the House of Luxembourg were deeply involved on the English side, for the family's lands and loyalties drew it into the Great War as allies of the English crown. A kinsman of Jacquetta was a powerful churchman who served the English government in France in the highest offices, a great prelate and statesman of the occupying regime. Others of her connection were soldiers and lords whose choices helped to shape the course of the war in the borderlands. The Luxembourgs were not bystanders, but players, their alliance worth courting, their enmity worth fearing. It was, in part, this very involvement of her family with the English cause that made Jacquetta's marriage to the Regent of France so natural a stroke of policy, for it bound an already friendly house more closely still. She came to her English marriage not as a stranger, but as a daughter of a family already tied to the English enterprise, a fitting bride for the man who governed that enterprise. And it meant that even after she settled in England, she remained connected to great affairs on the continent through her powerful kin. A woman whose family mattered in the councils of more than one land. The grandeur of the House of Luxembourg was not an empty inheritance, but a living power, and Jacquetta carried the weight and the worth of it into everything she did. The daughter of a house that helped to shape the destiny of nations. It is a poignant detail that Jacquetta's own father did not live to see her grand English marriage, for the Count died in the very year that his daughter was wed to the Regent of France. Passing from the world as she stepped onto its highest stage, the head of the House of Luxembourg, the man whose rank and policy had made his daughter a fit bride for a prince of England, was gone, and Jacquetta entered her dazzling marriage already, in that sense, on her own. The daughter of a dead count carrying her family's greatness into the English world. The timing is a small thing, but it marks the passing of one generation as another rose. The old count, dying as his daughter, was raised to a height beyond even his own. We do not know what Jacquetta felt at her father's death, coming as it did at the threshold of her marriage, but it would have been one of those joinings of grief and ceremony that life so often arranges. The loss of a father in the season of a wedding. Her family's greatness passed on without him, carried by his children into the next generation, and Jacquetta bore the Luxembourg name into England as the daughter of a count newly dead, the inheritor of a greatness that her father had helped to build, but did not live to see crowned by her marriage. It is the kind of detail that reminds us that behind the grand public events of such a life ran the ordinary human currents of birth and death and grief, the passing of parents and the rising of children that shape every life, however great. So when we say that Jacquetta was born to high rank, we are saying something more than that her father was a count, for she carried one of the most resounding names in Europe, a name that spoke of emperors and kings and the deepest antiquity of noble blood. This mattered enormously, both to how others saw her and to how she saw herself. For in an age that ordered everything by lineage and degree, to be a Luxembourg was to stand among the elect, to be the equal in blood of almost anyone alive. It explains the dazzling marriage she would make, for only a family of the very front rank could be matched with a Prince of England. And it explains, too, the unshakable sense of her own worth that seems to have carried her through every reversal of her life. She was bred to believe herself the equal of the greatest, and nothing that befell her ever quite took that from her. And there was something more to the Luxembourg name, a thread of legend that wound through the family's sense of itself, and that would, much later, be turned against Jacquetta in the most dangerous way. For the house claimed descent, in its old stories, from Melusine, a figure out of the deep well of medieval legend, a water spirit or fairy, beautiful and otherworldly, said in the romances to have been half woman and half serpent, and to have founded high noble lines before vanishing back into the element she came from. It was the kind of glamorous origin myth that proud families love to claim, a touch of the marvellous in the bloodline, and the Luxembourgs were not alone in tracing themselves to such a source. I should say plainly that we cannot know how much Jacquetta herself made of this legend, and some careful historians doubt that she gave it much thought at all. The romance of Melusine was a popular tale that many owned and enjoyed, and to own it was no strange thing. But the legend was there, attached to her name, waiting, and in the bitter years to come, it would be remembered by her enemies and used to paint a duchess as a sorceress, the descendant of a serpent woman, a worker of unnatural arts. That, though, lies far ahead of us. For now it is only a story in the background of a powerful family, a touch of fairy blood in the proud Luxembourg line. The legend of Melusine is worth telling in a little fuller form, for it is one of the strangest threads in Jacquetta's story, and it ran, real or not, beneath everything that was later said against her. In the old tale, as the romances told it, Melusine was a beautiful woman of mysterious origin, whom a nobleman met and loved and married, and who agreed to be his wife on a single condition: that he must never look upon her on a certain day of the week, when she withdrew herself in secret. For a time all was well, and she brought him wealth, and built him great castles, and bore him sons who founded mighty lines. But at last the husband broke his promise and spied upon her, and saw that on her forbidden day she took, from the waist down, the form of a serpent or a fish, a creature of the water, and with her secret discovered, Melusine cried out and fled, transformed, never to return, leaving her noble descendants behind her. It was a tale of the marvellous and the forbidden, of a fairy bride and a broken promise, and several leading families of France and the Low Countries claimed her as their ancestress, the House of Luxembourg among them. How seriously Jacquetta or her family took this glamorous descent, we honestly cannot say, and here I want to be careful, for the matter is often exaggerated. It is true that the romance of Melusine was known and owned in noble households, and that the Luxembourgs claimed the connection. But careful historians have pointed out that there is little real evidence. Jacquetta herself made much of the legend, and that to own and enjoy such a romance was an ordinary thing for a family of her rank, no sign of any dark belief. The descent from Melusine was a piece of family glamour, a marvellous origin story of the kind proud houses loved, no more sinister in itself than any other old legend. What matters for Jacquetta's story is not whether she believed it, which we cannot know, but that the legend existed, attached to her name, available to be used. For when her enemies wished to paint her as a worker of unnatural arts, the old tale of the serpent ancestress lay ready to their hand, a shadow on her lineage that could be made to seem to fit the charge. We do know one concrete thing about Jacquetta's connection to the Melusine legend, for it is recorded that she owned a copy of the romance that told the tale, the ancestral story of the serpent woman from whom her house claimed descent. But here again we must be careful in what we make of it, for the owning of such a book was no strange or sinister thing. Books were precious possessions in that age, owned by those of wealth and rank, and the romance of Melusine was a popular and a well-loved tale, copied and owned in many a noble household. Enjoyed as a good story and as a piece of the family lore of the mighty houses that claimed the fairy ancestress. For Jacquetta to own it was entirely natural, a noble lady possessing the romance of her own legendary forebear, no more a mark of dark practice than the owning of any other book of tales. So the detail of the owned romance, which might seem to point to some special devotion to the Melusine legend, points really to nothing of the kind, only to the ordinary bookishness of a grand lady who possessed the story of her house's mythical origin. It is the kind of fact that can be made to seem significant by those who wish to build a case. The Duchess who kept the Book of the Serpent Woman, but that dissolves, on examination, into the commonplace. A noblewoman owned a popular romance about her family's legendary ancestress. There is nothing in it but what 100 other grand households might show. Yet it is exactly such ordinary things. The owned book, the claimed descent, the strange love match, that could be gathered up and darkened and turned by a hostile imagination into the materials of an accusation of witchcraft. The truth was innocent. It was the use later made of it that was not. Of Jacquetta's girlhood we know very little, as is the way with the early years of medieval women, even the mighty, for the records noticed them only when they married or died or did something the chroniclers thought worth setting down. But we can say with confidence the shape of it, for the upbringing of a high noblewoman followed a known pattern, and Jacquetta would have been raised to it from her earliest years. She would have been taught to read, at least a little, and to pray, and to sew and to manage a household, the skills a noble lady would need. She would have learned the courtesies and the bearing of her rank, how to carry herself, how to command servants and order a household, how to be the lady of a noble house. She grew up amid wealth and ceremony, in castles and great halls, surrounded by the business of a powerful family, and she would have understood from childhood that her marriage would be a matter of high policy, arranged for the good of her house, and that she herself was a piece of great value on the board of European alliance. This was the world that formed her, a world of rank and duty and the marrying of bloodlines, and she was bred to play her part in it. The education given to a girl of Jacquetta's rank was real and considerable, even if it was not the education of a scholar, and it was aimed at making her a fit ornament and manager of a grand household. She would have been taught to read, and to follow the prayers of the church, and very likely to speak and understand more than one tongue, for the noble world of her region moved between French and the languages of the Low Countries, and a lady of rank might need them all. She would have learned music and dancing and the courtly accomplishments that graced a noblewoman, the ability to carry herself with elegance in the ceremonies of a mighty house. And she would have been trained, above all, in the practical arts of running a noble household, for an eminent lady was the mistress of a large and complex establishment, responsible for its order and its provisioning and its smooth running. And this was a serious skill that had to be learned. We can picture the texture of her girlhood days, even without records of the particular, for the rhythm of life in a high noble household followed a known shape. There would have been the offices of the church, marking the hours, for piety framed the day, with prayers and mass and the keeping of the holy seasons. There would have been lessons in letters and in the accomplishments of her rank. And there would have been the long hours of needlework and the ordering of the household that filled a noble lady's day. She would have lived amid the ceremony of a count's establishment, the formal meals in the hall, the coming and going of guests and retainers, the business of a powerful family conducted around her. It was a life of privilege and of constraint together, comfortable and ordered and hemmed about with the expectations of her rank. And through it ran the constant awareness, instilled from her earliest years, of who she was and what was expected of her. the sense of being a daughter of a grand house with a part to play in its fortunes. She would have known that she was destined for a great marriage, that her life would be shaped by the needs of her family, that her worth lay in the alliance she could make and the children she could bear. This was not, by the standards of her age, a hardship, but simply the condition of a noble woman's life, the frame within which she would live, and she was prepared for it, as girls of her rank had always been prepared. The girlhood that the records pass over in silence was, we may be sure, a thorough schooling in the being of a grand lady, the quiet making of the woman who would one day astonish her world by marrying for love. The religious devotion that framed a noble woman's life deserves its own word, for faith was not a compartment of life in that age, but the very air it breathed, and Jacquetta was a woman of her pious time. The day was marked by the hours of prayer, the year by the great festivals and fasts of the church, the whole of life surrounded by the rites and the consolations of religion, and a noble lady was expected to be devout, to keep her prayers, to hear mass, to give alms, and to support the church with her patronage. This was not mere form, but the deep frame of existence, the way the people of that age understood their lives and their deaths and their place in the order of things. And a woman of Jacquetta's rank would have been raised to a real and a practiced piety. Her faith would have been her chief resource in the trials that her life brought her, for it was to religion that the people of that age turned in grief and in fear, seeking in prayer and in the rites of the church the strength to bear what came. When Jacquetta lost her husband and her son, when she stood accused of the dreadful crime of sorcery, when she faced the perils and the bereavements of her later years, it would have been to her faith that she turned for endurance, as the people of her age did. There is a particular irony in this, that a woman of practiced Christian piety should be accused of the dark and forbidden arts of witchcraft, the very opposite of the faith she lived by. But it was a common irony of such accusations, which fell often enough on the devout, for the charge fed on suspicion and malice, not on any true reading of the accused. Jacquetta, the accused witch, was, by every likelihood, a woman of ordinary and sincere religious devotion, and that devotion was her shield in the worst of her trials. For the position of a noble woman, though it was hedged about with the rule of fathers and husbands, was not a powerless one within its own sphere, and Jacquetta was being trained to wield real authority. The lady of a great house commanded a household of servants, managed estates and accounts, dispensed hospitality and charity, and in the frequent absences of her husband at war or at court, might govern the whole of his lands and affairs in his stead. To do this well took intelligence and force of character and a thorough training in the business of management, and a girl of Jacquetta's rank was prepared for it from childhood. So her girlhood, of which the records tell us so little, was a schooling in the exercise of a grand lady's authority, the making of a woman who could command a household and manage an estate and hold her own in the high society of her age, skills she would need through all the turns of the remarkable life ahead of her. And then, while she was still very young, that part was assigned to her, and it was a dazzling one, far beyond what even a daughter of Luxembourg might have expected. For the man chosen to be her husband was no mere count or duke of the continent, but a prince of England, John, Duke of Bedford, the brother of the mighty warrior king, Henry V, and at that moment, one of the most powerful men in the Western world. Henry V was dead by now, dead young at the height of his triumph, leaving an infant son as King of England, and it was Bedford, the dead king's brother, who governed the English conquests in France as regent, ruling in the child king's name over the vast territories that English arms had won. To marry Bedford was to marry into the royal house of England itself, to become the wife of the regent of France, to step at a stroke into the very highest circle of power in the war-torn world of the early 15th century. For the House of Luxembourg, it was a magnificent alliance, binding them to the English cause and to one of the mightiest princes of the age, and for Jacquetta, it meant a future grander than almost any woman alive could claim. The man chosen for her, John of Lancaster, Duke of Bedford, deserves to be understood, for he was one of the towering figures of the age, and the marriage was a measure of Jacquetta's worth. He was a son of the English King Henry IV, and a brother of the great Henry V, the warrior king who had shattered the French at Agincourt and conquered much of northern France and been recognised as heir to the French crown itself. When Henry V died young, leaving only an infant son to inherit 2 kingdoms, it was Bedford, the ablest of the dead king's brothers, who took up the vast and crushing task of holding the English conquests in France and governing them in the baby king's name. He was the regent of France, the ruler of the English dominion there, a soldier and a statesman bearing on his shoulders the whole weight of the English enterprise across the sea. To be matched with such a man was to be lifted as high as a woman could be lifted, short of marrying a reigning king. And it tells us how the great powers valued the House of Luxembourg, that its daughter could be thought a fit wife for the regent of France. The marriage was a matter of high policy on every side, binding the Luxembourgs to the English cause at a moment when their support in the borderlands was precious, and giving Bedford a wife of impeccable rank and valuable connection. For Jacquetta, it meant a leap into the very heart of power, the wife of the man who ruled half of France for England, kin by marriage to the English crown. It was the kind of match that the daughters of the greatest houses dreamed of and rarely achieved, and it was settled upon her while she was still in her teens. The grand design of her elders into which she stepped, as she had always known she would, when her time came to be married, for the good of her house. The wedding itself, when it came in the spring of that year, would have been a grand occasion of state, for the marriage of the Regent of France to a daughter of Luxembourg demanded all the splendour the age could provide. Such weddings among the mighty were celebrated with ceremony and feasting and display, the joining of 2 mighty houses, marked by the gathering of nobles, the solemn rites of the church, the banqueting and the giving of gifts, the whole apparatus of magnificence by which the high nobility proclaimed its grandeur. The bride of 17 would have been arrayed in the richest fashion, the centre, for a day, of a great spectacle. Married to her aging prince before the assembled dignity of 2 realms. We may imagine too something of what the young bride felt, though the records do not tell us, for she was being married to a great and elderly man she can hardly have known, lifted in a single ceremony to a height beyond her imagining. There would have been awe, surely, and the weight of the occasion, and perhaps apprehension at the life opening before her. The marriage to a worn and aging statesman, the removal into the strange world of the English Regency. Whatever she felt, she would have carried herself as her rank required, the daughter of Luxembourg become the Duchess of Bedford, playing her part in the great ceremony with the bearing she had been bred to. It was the summit of everything she had been raised for, this dazzling wedding, and she can have had no inkling, as she stood arrayed beside her prince, of the far stranger turns that her life would take once this first grand chapter was closed. The mighty disparity of age between Jacquetta and her first husband, the girl of 17 and the worn and aging prince, was nothing remarkable by the standards of noble marriage in that age, and it is worth understanding why. The marriages of the highborn were arranged for dynastic and political ends, not for the matching of ages or temperaments, and it was common enough for a young woman to be married to a much older man, or for the ages of a couple to be widely separated, where the interests of the houses so dictated. A mighty lord, seeking a wife of suitable rank, or a noble house seeking a powerful match for its daughter, did not weigh the matter of years as we might. What counted was the rank, the alliance, the dynastic advantage. And youth in a bride was indeed prized, for a young wife might bear many children. So Jacquetta's marriage to the aging Bedford was an ordinary kind of match for the world she lived in. a young woman of high rank bestowed on a great and elderly man for reasons of state, and she would have expected nothing else. The notion that marriage should be a meeting of hearts, or even of ages, between two people who chose each other was not the governing idea of noble marriage in that age. Marriage was a matter of houses and alliances, and the feelings and the ages of the parties were secondary. This is what makes Jacquetta's second marriage so startling against the background of the first, for in marrying Richard Woodville for love, she was rejecting the whole principle on which her first marriage and the marriages of her world were made. The girl who had been bestowed on an aging prince for the good of her house chose the second time to bestow herself for love on a man of her own choosing, and in doing so she set her own heart against the whole custom of her age. So it was that in the spring of 1433, when she was about 17 years old, Jacquetta of Luxembourg was married to the Duke of Bedford and became, in that moment, the Duchess of Bedford, one of the first ladies of the English realm. She was his second wife, for his first had died, and he was a man much older than she, worn by the long labours of war and government, and by some accounts, already in failing health. We may imagine the wedding as a matter of grand state, as such a marriage demanded, the joining of a Prince of England to a daughter of Luxembourg, celebrated with all the ceremony the age could muster. Whatever the 17-year-old bride felt, stepping into marriage with a great and aging prince, she can hardly have known. She would have understood the magnitude of what was happening to her, the height to which she had been raised. She was now a duchess, the wife of the regent, kin by marriage to the King of England, lifted to a station that set her above almost every other woman in two kingdoms. It was the summit, or so it must have seemed, the brilliant match that the daughter of a mighty house was born for. We should pause on what this marriage meant in the great game of the war, for it was not only a personal elevation, but a diplomatic stroke of real weight. The lands of Jacquetta's family lay in the contested borderlands, and the loyalty of the House of Luxembourg was a prize both the English and the French dominions courted. For these were the regions through which armies moved, and on which the balance of the long war partly turned. By marrying the regent of France to a daughter of St. Paul, the English bound a powerful continental house more closely to their cause, strengthening their position in the very lands where it was most exposed. The marriage of a noble lady was, in that age, a move of statecraft as much as a personal union, a sealing of alliance between houses and causes, and Jacquetta was the seal of an alliance between the English regency and one of the first families of the continent. This is the thing to hold in mind about the marriages of great medieval women, that they were instruments of policy, and that the women themselves, however grand, were the means by which houses and kingdoms bound themselves together. Jacquetta, at 17, was not consulted on whether she wished to marry an aging prince of England. She was bestowed, as the daughters of the nobility were bestowed, where the interests of her family and the powers of the age directed. There is no reason to think she resented it, for she had been raised to expect exactly this, and the match raised her to a glittering height. But it is worth seeing clearly that her first marriage, for all its splendour, was a thing done to her and through her for the purposes of others. It makes what she did later, when she married the second time, for love and against all policy, the more startling, for she knew better than anyone the rules she was breaking. As Duchess of Bedford, Jacquetta passed into the strange and dangerous world of English-occupied France, for her husband's seat of government was there, in the lands the English crown claimed and struggled to hold. She would have known the great city of Rouen, the heart of English power in Normandy, and perhaps Paris itself, living amid the splendour and the tension of an occupying court. Surrounded by the wealth and ceremony of her husband's regency, and by the ever-present reality of the war that ground on around them, it was a glittering position and an uneasy one, for the English hold on France was already beginning to slip. These were the very years in which a peasant girl from Lorraine had raised the siege of Orleans, and seen the French Dauphin crowned at Reims, turning the long tide of the war. And though that girl was dead by the time Jacquetta married, burned at Rouen on English orders, the cause she had revived was rising. Into this realm of fading conquest and rising danger the young Duchess came, the wife of the man charged with holding it all together, and she lived for a few years at the very centre of the English enterprise in France, as grand a lady as the age could show. The court in which Jacquetta now moved was an occupying court in a hostile land, and its splendour was shadowed by the knowledge that the great enterprise it served was beginning to fail. The English had conquered much of northern France, and held it by force and by the alliance of French lords who had taken their side. And the heart of their power was at Rouen, the great Norman city where Bedford's government sat. There Jacquetta would have known a court of real magnificence, for the English dukes lived in high state, surrounded by the wealth of their conquests and the ceremony of their rank, and as the regent's wife she stood at its summit. But it was magnificence built on a slipping foundation, for the French cause, so nearly crushed a few years before, had been astonishingly revived. The life of a lady of rank in those years involved much travel, and travel was no light matter, for it meant long journeys by land and the always dangerous crossing of the sea between England and France. The narrow sea that divided the two realms was a perilous passage in the ships of that age, at the mercy of storms and contrary winds, and a crossing could be delayed for days or turned into an ordeal by foul weather. Yet it had to be made, again and again, by those whose lives spanned both shores. Jacquetta, whose marriage placed her in the English world that straddled the Channel, would have known these crossings and these journeys, the moving of a noble household with its baggage and its servants across land and water, the discomfort and the danger of medieval travel undertaken in high style. An eminent lady did not travel alone or lightly, but with a whole household about her, attendants and servants and guards, the apparatus of her rank moving with her, for her dignity had to be maintained on the road as at home. The journeys were slow and wearing, the roads poor, the inns or lodgings uncertain, the whole business and undertaking that we, who cross such distances in hours, can scarcely imagine. Yet this was the texture of a grand life in that age, the long progresses and the dangerous crossings, the moving of the household from place to place, as duty and circumstance required. Jacquetta's life, spanning France and England, husband after husband, court after court, would have been a life much spent in travel, and the dangers of the road and the sea were among the ordinary perils she lived with, as did everyone whose station kept them moving across the divided and dangerous world of the 15th century. The household that surrounded a lady of rank was a world in itself, an establishment of servants and attendants and officers that moved with her and served her every need, and it is worth picturing, for it was the daily setting of Jacquetta's life. There were the gentlewomen who attended her person, ladies of good birth, who served a grand lady as companions and helpers. There were the servants of every degree who ran the household, from the officers who managed its business to the humblest who did its labour. There were chaplains for her devotions, and grooms for her horses, and all the apparatus of a grand establishment. A duchess did not dress or dine or travel or pray without attendants about her, for her rank required to be served and surrounded, and the maintaining of a large household was itself one of the chief expressions of her dignity. To be the mistress of such a household was to govern a small world, and it was a serious responsibility and a real authority, the kind that Jacquetta had been trained from girlhood to exercise. She ordered this establishment, set its tone, commanded its members, dispensed its hospitality and charity, and bore the weight of its smooth running. The lady at the centre of a complex and a populous realm. We should not picture her, then, as a solitary figure, but as the head of a household, surrounded always by her people, her gentle women and her servants and her officers. The centre of a busy establishment that was the setting and the instrument of her noble life, Whether at the court of France or the court of England or the family seat at Grafton, Jacquetta lived always within this sphere of attendance and service, the daily reality of a noble lady's existence. Served and surrounded, and at the head of her own small commonwealth of dependents. It had been revived only a few years before Jacquetta came to France by the most famous episode of the whole war, the rising of the peasant girl from the eastern marches who declared that God had sent her to save France, who put on armour and raised the siege of Orleans, and saw the disinherited French prince crowned as king in the Cathedral of Reims. That girl had been captured and sold to the English and burned as a heretic in the marketplace of Rouen, the very city of Bedford's government, only about 2 years before Jacquetta arrived there as Duchess. And though she was dead, the tide she had turned was still running, and the French were pressing back. So the young Duchess came into a court that was grand and uneasy together, presiding over a conquest that was beginning to crumble, and the splendour around her was the splendour of a cause whose great days were already passing. It was a strange and a charged world in which to begin her married life, the glittering court of a failing dominion. But the marriage was short, as marriages to ageing and ailing men so often were, and it gave Jacquetta no children to anchor her to the high position she had won. In the autumn of 1435, only about 2 years after the wedding, the Duke of Bedford died, worn out at last, and Jacquetta found herself, at 19 or thereabouts, a widow. She was a widow of the very highest rank, to be sure, Dowager Duchess of Bedford, kin to the English crown, entitled to a great dower of lands and income, a woman of wealth and standing in her own right. But she was also, suddenly, a young widow without a husband to define her place, a rich prize once more on the marriage market. For a wealthy and well-connected Dowager Duchess of 19 was exactly the kind of woman whose hand kings and lords would wish to bestow where it suited their policy. Her future was open again, and it was not, by the custom of her world, hers to decide. A woman of her value would be married where her menfolk and her sovereign saw fit. So she stood, at 19, at a crossroads she had not chosen, a wealthy widow whose next marriage would be a matter of state. And it is here that her life takes the first of its astonishing turns. The position of a noble widow in that age was a curious mixture of power and vulnerability, and Jacquetta's was the highest a widow could hold. By the law and custom of the time, a widow was entitled to her dower, a portion of her late husband's lands and income set aside for her support for the rest of her life. And the dower of the Duchess of Bedford was a mighty one, for she had been the wife of one of the richest men in the realm. So Jacquetta was left a wealthy woman in her own right, with lands and revenues at her command, and a degree of independence that a wife did not enjoy, for a widow, unlike a wife or an unmarried girl, was in some real sense her own mistress, able to hold property and order her affairs. In this she was better placed than most women of her age, a rich dowager of the highest rank. There is a human reality behind the legal position of the young widow, and it is worth pausing on. For Jacquetta was, when Bedford died, still only about 19, a girl by our reckoning, suddenly alone at the head of a lofty position. Whatever the wealth and rank that came to her as Dowager Duchess, she was a very young woman who had been married to an aging man for the purposes of state, and was now, in a strange country, far from her own family, left without a husband to define and protect her. The loneliness of such a position must have been real. The sense of being a valuable prize and a great responsibility, both watched and valued, and yet without the companionship and the settled place that marriage gave. She had been raised for this kind of life, but raised for it did not mean shielded from its loneliness. And she would have known that her freedom was temporary, that the question of her remarriage hung over her, that her hand would soon be the subject of negotiation among the great, to be bestowed where policy directed. To be a young widow of high rank was to be, in a sense, in suspense, between the marriage that had ended and the marriage that others would arrange, with little say in either. It is against this background of young widowhood, this loneliness and this suspense, and this knowledge of being a piece to be moved, that we should set her astonishing decision to marry Richard Woodville for love. It was the choice of a very young woman who had been disposed of once for the purposes of others, and who resolved, given the chance, to dispose of herself this time for the sake of her own heart, whatever it cost her. Seen so, the boldness of it becomes also, perhaps, the longing of a lonely girl for a marriage of her own choosing. The freedom that widowhood gave a woman stands out so sharply because the rest of a woman's life, by the law and custom of that age, was so hedged about with the authority of men. An unmarried girl was under the rule of her father or her guardian, her marriage and her future in their hands. A wife was, in the eyes of the law, in large measure subsumed in her husband, who held authority over her person and her property, so that a married woman could own little and act little in her own right. The law gave the husband immense power and the wife little independent standing, for the principle of the age was that a wife and her husband were, in law, in some sense, one person, and that one the husband. A woman passed, in the ordinary course, from the authority of her father to the authority of her husband, with little space of her own in between. It was widowhood, and widowhood almost alone, that gave a woman a measure of independent standing. The right to hold her dower and her property, to act in her own name, to order her own affairs, even, with the king's leave, to choose whether and whom to marry again. A widow of rank and means was the freest a woman could be, mistress of her own person and her own property, in a way that neither maid nor wife could be. And this is why the remarriage of a widow of rank was so fraught a matter, for it meant the passing of her wealth and her freedom back under a husband's authority. Jacquetta, twice a widow in her life, knew both states. The independence of the dowager and the subjection of the wife, and her famous choice to marry Richard Woodville was, among other things, the choice to give up the rare freedom of the dowager for the sake of a marriage of her own heart. She traded independence for love, knowingly, the freest woman choosing to bind herself again for the man she had chosen. But the very wealth and rank that gave her independence also made her a prize, and a great widow was rarely left long to enjoy her freedom, for her hand was too valuable to go unclaimed. A wealthy, well-connected, still young dowager duchess was exactly the kind of woman whose remarriage was a matter of interest to the crown and to every ambitious lord, for whoever married her would gain her wealth and her connection and her royal kinship. By custom and by law, a widow of her standing could not simply marry as she pleased. She required the king's permission to remarry, and the expectation was that her hand would be bestowed where it served the interests of the crown and the realm. So Jacquetta's freedom was a limited and a temporary thing. The brief independence of a wealthy widow who knew that her sovereign would soon dispose of her hand to some suitable lord. It was against this expectation, this assumption that her marriage was the king's to bestow, that she was about to rebel. For there was, in the household of the late Duke, a knight named Richard Woodville, and it was he who would change the whole course of Jacquetta's life. Richard Woodville was a soldier, a man who had followed his father into the service of the Duke of Bedford, a capable and, by all accounts, a strikingly handsome man, well thought of for his skill at arms and his bearing. But he was a knight, and no more than a knight, a man of the gentry, far, far below the Dowager Duchess of Bedford in rank, the kind of man who might serve a grand lady, but could never, in the ordinary run of things, dream of marrying one. When the young King of England, Henry VI, wished his widowed aunt by marriage to come to England, it was Richard Woodville who was given the charge of escorting her across the sea and seeing her safely to the English court. And somewhere in that service, in the close company of the journey and the months that followed, the noble Duchess and the handsome knight fell in love. The Woodville family from which Richard came was a respectable one of the English gentry, but it was nothing remotely approaching the rank of a Luxembourg duchess, and that gulf is the whole point of what follows. The Woodvilles were landed gentlefolk of Northamptonshire, the kind of family that produced capable knights and useful royal servants, men who served the great and held local offices and married within their own middling sphere. Richard's father had served the Duke of Bedford before him, and Richard had followed into that service, a soldier of skill and a man of notably handsome person, well regarded in the Duke's household. He was, in short, a fine specimen of the knightly class. A man a powerful lord was glad to have in his service, but he was emphatically not of the rank from which dukes' widows chose their husbands. And in the ordinary working of the world, he could no more have married the Duchess of Bedford than he could have flown. This is what made what happened so extraordinary and so scandalous, for the distance between a Duchess of the blood of Luxembourg and a knight of the Northamptonshire gentry was immense, one of those gulfs of rank that the medieval world took with deadly seriousness. For such a pair to marry was to violate the entire order of degree on which society rested, to mingle the highest blood with the merely respectable, a thing that offended every assumption of the age. And yet Richard Woodville had the charge of escorting the noble widow, was thrown into her close company, and was, by every account, a man of unusual attractiveness and address. Whatever passed between them in the months of that service, the impossible happened. The Duchess and the knight came to love each other across the vast gulf of rank, and Jacquetta resolved to do the one thing that her whole upbringing forbade, and marry the man she loved, rather than the lord her king would choose. The gossip and the scandal that the marriage provoked would have run through every level of society, for nothing delighted and shocked the medieval world quite like a great person stepping outside the bounds of rank. That the king's own aunt, a duchess of the blood of Luxembourg, had secretly married a mere knight was the kind of news that flew from mouth to mouth through the court and the country. A delicious and a disgraceful scandal that everyone would have had an opinion on. The fashionable world would have been agog and appalled, the common people would have marvelled, and there would have been those who whispered, even then, that there must be something strange in a duchess marrying so far beneath her, some hidden reason, some unnatural cause, for why else would a noble lady so demean herself? That whisper is worth marking, for it points ahead to the dark use that would one day be made of Jacquetta's choices. To a society that ordered everything by rank, a duchess marrying a knight for love was not merely scandalous, but almost unnatural. Something that seemed to need explaining, and the readiest explanation, to minds steeped in such ideas, was that some power beyond ordinary love had been at work. We need not think that many seriously believed this at the time. It was the stuff of gossip, not of accusation. But the seed was there, in the very strangeness of her choice. The notion that a woman who married so far beneath her, and whose daughter would later marry a king, must have used some art beyond nature to bring such things about. The scandal of the love match, harmless enough in itself, helped to lay the ground, decades in advance, for the charge of sorcery that her enemies would one day raise. There is a feature of the law and the thinking of that age that we must understand if we are to see how an accusation like the one against Jacquetta could carry weight. And that is the notion of common fame. The idea that the general report and talk of the people was itself a kind of evidence. In the legal thinking of the time, what was widely said and believed about a person, the common voice and fame, could be treated as grounds for suspicion and even for proceeding against them, as though the fact that a thing was rumoured was itself a reason to think it might be true. This is a way of thinking very foreign to us, who hold that rumour proves nothing, but it was deeply rooted in that age. The notion that there was no smoke without fire, that what everyone said must have something in it. This is why the document that revived the charge against Jacquetta after her death could rest its accusation of witchcraft on the common opinion of the people and the public voice and fame, as though the mere existence of the rumour were a kind of proof. And it is why an accusation, once raised, was so dangerous, for it fed the very rumour that could then be cited as evidence of its truth. A vicious circle in which the charge created the fame that seemed to support the charge. Against a woman like Jacquetta, around whom the strange facts of her life, the love match, the royal marriage, the legendary ancestress, had bred a certain talk. This way of thinking was peculiarly perilous, for it meant that the very strangeness of her story could be turned into the common fame that lent colour to the charge of sorcery. The law's respect for rumour was one of the things that made the weapon of witchcraft so deadly, and Jacquetta, a woman much talked of, was the more exposed to it. It was an impossible love by every measure of their world, for the gulf of rank between them was immense, and a dowager duchess kin to the crown did not marry a simple knight. Such a thing overturned the whole order of things. Jacquetta knew, none better, what was expected of a woman of her station, that her hand would be bestowed by the king on some great lord, that her marriage was a matter of high policy in which her own heart had no recognised place. And yet she chose, against all of it, to follow her heart, and she and Richard Woodville did the unthinkable. They married quietly and in secret, without the king's permission, binding themselves to each other before anyone could prevent it. It was an act of extraordinary boldness and of extraordinary risk, for to marry without the sovereign's leave and to marry so far beneath her was to defy the king and the whole expectation of her class. She had been raised to be a piece in the game of alliance, and she had taken herself off the board for love. I find it one of the most striking matters about her. This choice made young and made twice over in her life, to follow her own heart against the full weight of her world. We should understand just how serious it was in that age for a widow of rank to marry without her sovereign's leave. For this was no mere breach of etiquette, but a defiance of the king's rights and the order of the realm. The crown held that the marriages of its widows of rank and heiresses were, in effect, at its disposal, a valuable form of patronage to be granted to favoured lords. And a tenant-in-chief's widow, who married without licence, was held to have offended the king and was liable to a heavy penalty. To marry where one chose, and especially to marry far beneath one, was to throw away one's value in the marriage market, and to flout the king's authority over it, an act of self-will that the highborn were not supposed to permit themselves. Jacquetta knew all of this perfectly well, for she had been raised in the very heart of the system. She knew that her hand was, in the eyes of the world, the king's to bestow, and that to dispose of it herself, on a night, was to court real danger. That she did it anyway is the measure of her boldness, and perhaps of her love, and it is worth dwelling on. For it was an act against the whole grain of her world. She had everything to lose by it, her standing, the king's favour, the wealth that depended on royal goodwill, and she risked it all to marry a man she could not, by any rule of policy, be permitted to marry. The secrecy of the marriage was a measure of the danger, for they bound themselves to each other quietly, confronting everyone with an accomplished fact rather than asking a permission they knew would be refused. It was the gamble of a woman who had decided that her own heart's choice was worth the wrath of a king, and it is, to my mind, the act that reveals her most truly, the lady of rank, who, given the chance to follow love against policy, took it, and took the consequences, and never, as far as we can tell, regretted it. We can imagine, though we cannot document, how the love between the dowager and the handsome knight grew in the months of their enforced companionship, for the human story behind the bare fact is not hard to picture. Richard Woodville had the charge of attending and escorting the Dowager Duchess, of seeing to her safety and her comfort, of being constantly in her company through the business of her affairs and perhaps the dangers of travel. And in that close and constant attendance, a young widow and a capable, attractive man thrown daily together, feeling had room to grow. It was the kind of situation in which attachments form, the daily companionship, the shared concerns, the reliance of the lady on the man who served and protected her, ripening by degrees into something more than service. There is something very human and very recognizable in this, the love that grows from companionship and trust, from the daily nearness of two people brought together by circumstance, and it needs no fairy enchantment to explain it, whatever her enemies would later claim. A lonely young widow, far from her own family, attended by a handsome and capable man on whom she came to rely, formed an attachment to him that grew into love and into the resolve to marry him. It is a story as old and as ordinary as humanity, and it requires no sorcery, only the human heart. That her enemies would one day try to explain her choices by witchcraft tells us more about their malice than about her, for the truth of how she came to love Richard Woodville was, in all likelihood, the plainest and most human truth in the world, the growth of love between two people thrown together by the turns of fortune. The secret could not be kept forever, and when it came out, in the year 1437, the scandal was enormous. That the king's own aunt, the Dowager Duchess of Bedford, the widow of a prince of England, had secretly married a mere knight was a thing to shock the whole court, an outrage against rank and propriety, and the young king was, by all accounts, enraged. The couple had defied him and flouted the order of the realm, and there had to be a price. That price was a fine, and a heavy one, £1,000, an immense sum in the money of that age, enough to ruin many a lesser family. For a time, the future must have looked dark for the Duchess and her knight, married for love and facing the wrath of the crown. And yet the storm passed more gently than it might have done. The king, having made his displeasure, felt relented. The heavy fine was remitted, forgiven, within the same year, and what was more, the marriage was allowed to stand and their children permitted to inherit, which was no small thing for a match so far outside the rules. Jacquetta's rank and her royal kinship had shielded her, in the end, from the worst, and the scandalous marriage, having cost a fright and a fine that was never paid, was let be. The fine of £1,000 gives us a measure of the king's anger, for it was a colossal sum in the money of that day. A fortune that would have been quite beyond the reach of an ordinary family, and that even the great felt as a heavy blow. To understand it, we must remember that this was a time when a substantial gentleman might live on a fraction of such a sum in a year, and £1,000 represented wealth on the scale of the higher nobility. To be fined, it was to be threatened with real ruin. The size of the penalty was the measure of the offence as the Crown saw it, the defiance of the king's authority and the violation of rank, and it was meant to show that such things could not be done lightly. For a time, under the shadow of that fine, the future of the Duchess and her knight must have looked precarious indeed. And yet, as we have seen, the king relented, and the relenting tells us something of the man on the throne and of Jacquetta's standing. The king was Henry VI, a young man of gentle and pious temperament, not given to harshness or to the relentless pressing of a grievance. And once his displeasure had been shown, he was willing enough to forgive. Jacquetta's rank and her royal kinship surely weighed with him, for she was his aunt by marriage, a princess of the blood by her first husband, not a woman to be ground into ruin over a marriage that was after all already made. So the fine was remitted within the year, forgiven rather than exacted, and the marriage was suffered to stand, with the further grace that the children of it were allowed to inherit, which was no small concession for a union so far outside the rules. The storm, which had threatened so darkly, blew over, and Jacquetta and her knight were left to make their life together, the danger past and the marriage secure. Once the storm of the secret marriage had blown over, Jacquetta and Richard settled into a long stretch of life, lived close to the Lancastrian court, restored to favour and rising steadily in the world. Jacquetta's rank as Dowager Duchess of Bedford and her royal kinship gave her a great place at the court of King Henry VI, and she was among the senior ladies who attended the Queen and graced the grand occasions of the realm. Her husband served the crown in arms and office, climbing in the royal favour, and the family's standing grew through the years of the Lancastrian peace before the wars came. It was a good time for them, these middle years, the scandal forgiven, the marriage prospering, their place at court secure. This long Lancastrian chapter is easily forgotten, overshadowed by the dramas that came before and after. But it was the settled heart of Jacquetta's life, decades in which she was an eminent lady of the Lancastrian court, the wife of a rising royal servant, the mother of a growing family. She would have known the splendours and the intrigues of the court of Henry and Margaret, played her part in its ceremonies, watched her children grow toward the marriages and careers that lay ahead. There was nothing in these comfortable years to foretell the catastrophe that was coming. The wars that would shatter the Lancastrian world and carry her family to the enemy camp and very nearly to destruction. For now it was enough that the scandalous marriage had turned out well, that she and her knight were established and rising, living the good full life of the high nobility in the years before the storm broke over England. We should pause on the sheer fact of Jacquetta's childbearing, for it was the great labour and the great danger of her life, and it is too easily passed over in a phrase. To bear 14 children, or even the dozen who are said to have survived, was to spend the better part of her adult life in a long succession of pregnancies and births, year after year, across decades, the bearing and the rearing of child after child. And every one of those births was a peril, for childbirth was among the chief dangers to a woman's life in that age, a peril that carried off mothers in great numbers, with little that the medicine of the day could do to help when things went wrong. Each pregnancy was a risk taken, each birth a passage through danger, and a woman who bore as many children as Jacquetta did faced that danger again and again across her childbearing years. That she came through it all, bearing so many children and living to old age, was itself a kind of fortune, for many women of her age did not survive their childbearing, and the large family that was her glory was bought at the constant risk of her life. We honour, rightly, the chief public dramas of her story, the marriages and the accusation and the rest, but we should not forget this long private labour that ran beneath them all. The years of childbearing that were the real and constant work of her life as a wife. The matriarch of the noble Woodville brood was a woman who had passed through the danger of childbirth more times than almost any of us can imagine, and her fruitfulness, so prized by her age, was also a long courage, the repeated facing of mortal danger that was the lot of the childbearing wife. Behind the 14 children lay 14 perils survived, a hidden heroism of the kind that the chronicles never thought to record. And so began what was, by every sign we have, a long and a happy and a remarkably fruitful marriage, the most settled and human part of Jacquetta's whole extraordinary life. Richard Woodville rose in the world, as a man married to so great a lady might, for Jacquetta's continuing prominence in the royal family lifted him with her. He was given honours and offices, served the crown in war and peace, and climbed steadily from simple knight toward the higher nobility. The two of them, the Duchess and the soldier, made a partnership that lasted for decades and weathered everything the turbulent years would throw at it, and at the centre of it was a marriage that had been made against all the rules. Love. There is something deeply appealing in this, in the picture of the great lady who gave up the safety of her rank for a handsome knight, and found, in defiance of all prudence, a long and a happy life with him. The gamble she had taken at her most vulnerable, the marriage that had scandalized a kingdom, turned out to be the making of her happiness. The rise of Richard Woodville through the lengthy middle years of the marriage was steady and real, the climbing of an able man lifted by his wife's powerful connection. He served the crown in arms, holding commands and offices, and was employed in the wars and the government of the realm, a useful and a capable royal servant who steadily accumulated honours and trust. He held important charges, including a share in the keeping of the great fortress of Calais, the last English foothold on the continent, and he was raised in the peerage, given a barony and a place among the lords, climbing well above the simple knighthood from which he had started. It was a respectable and a rising career, the career of a man who had married brilliantly and made the most of it, and through it, the family's fortunes were steadily built up across the years of peace and war. At the centre of this rising family was the home the couple made together, and the chief of their houses was at Grafton in Northamptonshire, the seat that would be the heart of the Woodville world. There, across the long decades of the marriage, Jacquetta and Richard raised their large brood of children and built up their estate and their standing, a duchess and a baron, living the life of the higher gentry and the rising nobility. It was, by every sign that has come down to us, a settled and a contented life, the daily round of a great household and a growing family, the management of lands, the marrying off of children, the slow accumulation of honour and wealth. After the drama of the secret marriage and the king's anger, the middle years of Jacquetta's life seemed to have been her happiest and most ordinary. The long settled stretch of a marriage made for love and proving, year by year, to have been worth the gamble. Grafton, the family's chief seat, was the still centre of the Woodville world, and it is worth dwelling on, for it was here that the long ordinary life of the family was lived between the dramas that history records. It was a manor in the heart of England, in Northamptonshire, the kind of comfortable country seat that a family of the higher gentry and nobility would hold, with its house and its lands and its place at the centre of local life. Here, Jacquetta and Richard made their home across the decades of their marriage, and here their numerous family of children was raised in the rhythms of a country estate, the round of the seasons and the farming year, and the management of the land. It was a world away from the glittering court of France, where Jacquetta had begun her married life, this English country home, and yet it was, by every sign, where she found her deepest contentment. For it was at Grafton that the human heart of her story was lived, the long contented marriage and the raising of the family, the part of her life that the chronicles do not trouble to record, because it was happy and ordinary and made no momentous events. We should hold this domestic centre in mind against all the high drama, for it was the truth of most of her days, not the court and the war and the accusation, but the country house and the husband and the many children, the ordinary business of a grand household in the English shires. When the time came that her family was raised to the heights and then cast down, it was from this settled country world that they were lifted and into ruin that they were thrown, and it was at Grafton, the home of all those years, that Jacquetta came at last to die. The manor that had been the scene of her happiness was the scene, too, of her ending. The manor world in which so much of Jacquetta's life was lived had a physical texture worth conjuring, for it was the setting of her happiest years. A grand manor of that age was a cluster of buildings about a hall, the hall itself the heart of the establishment, a great room where the household gathered and dined and conducted its common life, and around it the chambers and the kitchens and the offices, the chapel for devotions, the stables and the barns and the buildings of the estate. Beyond lay the lands that supported it all, the fields and the pastures and the woods, worked by the tenants and labourers whose lives were bound to the manor, the whole forming a little world more or less complete in itself, the seat and the support of the family that held it. The life lived in such a place followed the rhythm of the seasons and the days, the round of the farming year, the keeping of the church's feasts and fasts, the daily business of a noble household and a working estate. It was a life of relative comfort for the family at its head, though rude enough by our soft standards, lived amid the smells and the labour of a working countryside, lit by fire and candle, warmed by the great hearths, ordered by the slow turning of the agricultural year. This was the world of Jacquetta's long middle years. The manor at Grafton and its lands and its people, the country setting in which she raised her family and lived the settled heart of her life. When we picture her, we should picture her not only at the glittering courts, but here, at the centre of a country household, the mistress of a large manor in the English shires, living the deep, ordinary life that the histories, hungry for drama, so largely pass over. Above all, the marriage was extraordinarily fruitful, for Jacquetta and Richard Woodville had a very large family, a sprawling brood of children, born across the lengthy years of their union. The sources tell us of 14 children, or perhaps a dozen who lived. A remarkable number, even by the standards of an age that prized fertility, and it made Jacquetta the matriarch of a large and rising clan. In a world that measured the worth of a noble wife in no small part by the children she bore, and above all by sons to carry on the line and daughters to marry well. Jacquetta's fruitfulness was a kind of triumph, the foundation of the family's future greatness. These many children, growing up in the household of the Duchess and her knight, were the seed of the whole Woodville ascendancy that was to come, the sons who would rise to honours, and the daughters who would be married into the nobility. And the eldest of them all, the first of that great brood, was a daughter, a girl of remarkable beauty, who was given her mother's grace and something more, and who would carry the family to a height that not even Jacquetta could have dreamed. Her name was Elizabeth, the marrying of Jacquetta's many children, once her daughter had become queen, was one of the great instruments of the family's rise, and it shows us the matriarch's world at its most calculating and its most successful. A queen's brothers and sisters were among the most desirable matches in the kingdom, for to marry one was to ally oneself with the royal family, and the Woodvilles used this to the full, making a string of brilliant marriages that tied them to the greatest houses in England. Daughters were wedded to heirs of earldoms and dukedoms, sons matched with great heiresses, the whole clan woven by marriage into the highest nobility, until the Queen's family was connected to half the peerage. It was the ordinary strategy of a noble family raised suddenly high, the using of marriage to consolidate and extend a new won position, and the Woodvilles pursued it with conspicuous success. Jacquetta's own place at the court of her royal son-in-law was one of remarkable eminence, for as the mother of the Queen, she stood very near the summit of the kingdom's society. By the strict reckoning of precedents that governed the court, Jacquetta, as Dowager Duchess of Bedford and mother of the Queen, ranked among the very first ladies of the land, taking precedence over almost every other woman at court. Her standing was such that she outranked even the mother of the king himself, a striking measure of the height to which the once scandalous Duchess had risen, and she held the highest place of any woman save the Queen her daughter. It was an extraordinary position for the woman who had married a poor knight. To stand second only to her own daughter among all the ladies of England, and she was not merely a figure of precedence, but, by every sign, an active and an influential presence at her daughter's court, a great matriarch at the centre of the Woodville ascendancy. The mother of the Queen, kin to the crown, head of a family rising to dominate the court, Jacquetta was a person of real consequence in these years of triumph. her long life of rank and experience now crowned by this eminence. She had known the court of France as the regent's wife and the court of Lancaster as a grand lady, and now she knew the court of York as the Queen's mother. Standing through all the turns of fortune among the first people of the realm. It was the summit of her worldly career. This position at her daughter's court, the scandalous bride became the matriarch of the royal family, and she held it for a few brilliant years, before the storm of Warwick's hatred swept it all away. The many children Jacquetta bore went out into the world to varied and, in several cases, to hard fates, for they lived in dangerous times and were raised, through their sister's marriage, into the most perilous heights of the kingdom. Her eldest son grew into a man of notable cultivation, as well as arms, a knight renowned for his accomplishments, learned and devout and skilled in the tournaments of the age, one of the ornaments of the Yorkist court. In time he would inherit his father's earldom and play a great part in the affairs of the realm. Others of her sons and daughters married into the high nobility and made their lives among the great, sharing in the family's dazzling rise, too often in its dangers. For the heights to which the Woodvilles were raised were heights from which one could fall hard, and the dynastic wars that made the family also threatened, again and again. To destroy it, several of Jacquetta's children met violent or untimely ends in the turbulent years of the wars and their aftermath, caught up, as the whole family was, in the deadly turns of dynastic fortune. To be the kin of a queen in such an age was to be exposed to the full force of every political storm, and the Woodvilles paid for their greatness in blood more than once. Husbands and sons and brothers lost to the executions and the battles of the time. Jacquetta herself lived to see some of this, the loss of her husband and a son to Warwick's malice. Mercifully, perhaps, she did not live to see the further losses that came after her death, the later destruction that fell upon her family in the next great turn of the wheel. The large family she had borne and raised was scattered by fortune into glory and into tragedy, and the story of her children is the story, in little, of a family raised too high, in too dangerous an age, dazzling and imperiled together. For Jacquetta, the mother of all these children, it must have been a remarkable thing to behold. The brood she had borne her knight in the long quiet years now spreading through the nobility of England, her daughters becoming countesses and duchesses, her sons lords. She had been the scandalous bride who married beneath her, and now she was the matriarch of a family marrying into the very summit of the realm, her blood flowing into the greatest houses through the marriages of her many children. It was the kind of triumph that a medieval noblewoman measured her life by, the successful establishment of her children in great positions, and Jacquetta achieved it on a scale few could match. But such a rise, as we have seen and shall see again, was watched with envy and resentment by those it displaced, and the very brilliance of the Woodville marriages helped to gather the storm that would break so terribly upon the family in the end. Elizabeth Woodville, Jacquetta's eldest daughter, grew into a woman of famous beauty, and her early life followed, at first, an ordinary enough path for a young woman of the gentry. She was married young to a knight, a man of Lancastrian loyalty, and bore him 2 sons, settling into the life of a knight's wife on his lands. But the wars that were gathering over England would shatter that ordinary life. For Elizabeth's husband was killed fighting for the Lancastrian cause, and she was left a young widow with 2 small sons and an uncertain future, struggling to secure her son's inheritance against the disorder of the times. It is a thing worth holding in mind that both mother and daughter were widowed young and left to fend for themselves, for it draws the 2 lives together, and what happened next would bind them more tightly still. The beautiful widow and daughter of the scandalous Duchess was about to make a match that would make her mother's seem almost ordinary by comparison. The circumstances of Elizabeth's widowhood and the famous story of how she came to the king's notice are worth telling, for they show the same boldness in the daughter that the mother had shown a generation before. Left a widow with 2 young sons and her late husband's lands in dispute, Elizabeth needed the king's help to secure her children's inheritance. And by the story that has come down to us, she sought to put her case to Edward IV in person. The tradition, which we cannot fully verify and which has surely been polished in the telling, holds that she waited for the king beneath an oak tree as he rode out to hunt, her 2 small sons beside her, and there made her plea, and that the young king, struck by her beauty, was captivated on the spot. Whether it happened quite so, under the oak, with the children at her skirts, we cannot know, for it is the kind of romantic detail that gathers around such stories. But something of the sort brought the beautiful widow and the amorous king together. What followed showed that Elizabeth had inherited her mother's strength of will, for by the account that has come down she refused to become the king's mistress, however he pressed her, holding out for honourable marriage or nothing. She would not be merely used and set aside, this widow of modest rank. She held her ground and her honour, and the king, inflamed rather than cooled by her refusal, was brought at last to the astonishing resolve to marry her. It was the same pattern, in a way, as her mother's life. A woman of will, refusing to be merely disposed of, insisting on marriage and her own choice against the expectations of the great, and winning. Jacquetta, watching her daughter hold out for marriage to a king, must have seen something of her own younger self in it. The same refusal to take the path that others laid down, and the same willingness to gamble everything on a marriage that the world would call impossible. It is worth remembering that Elizabeth brought 2 young sons into her royal marriage, the children of her first husband, and that these boys were Jacquetta's grandsons, woven into the strange destiny of the family. When their mother became queen, these boys of her first marriage were suddenly the stepsons of the king and the grandsons of the queen's mother, lifted with the rest of the family into the dazzling new world of royal favour. They would be advanced and married well, as the queen's kin were advanced and married, sharing in the family's rise. And one of them would go on to a prominent and ultimately a tragic part in the dramas of the reign, for these were dangerous heights to be raised to. For Jacquetta, the elevation of her daughter brought a whole new generation into the orbit of the crown, her grandchildren by Elizabeth's first marriage, and in time, her grandchildren by the king, the royal children themselves. She lived to see her blood not merely married to the king, but seated on the steps of the throne. Her daughter, the queen, her grandchildren, princes and princesses of England. The line of the scandalous duchess raised to the royal house itself. It was a vertiginous rise for a family that had been gentry within living memory, and Jacquetta stood at the head of it. The matriarch whose own bold marriage had begun the climb that her daughter's even bolder marriage had carried to the throne. The grandsons waiting under the oak with their mother, in the old story of the king's first sight of Elizabeth, were part of a family about to be lifted higher than any of them could have dreamed. The grandchildren that her daughter bore to the king were princes and princesses of England, and through them Jacquetta's blood was carried to the very heart of the royal succession, with all the peril as well as the glory that this entailed. The royal children, the sons and daughters of Edward and Elizabeth, were the future of the dynasty, the heirs to the throne and the brides and grooms of great alliance. And Jacquetta lived to see her own descendants standing in this exalted and exposed position. The grandchildren of the scandalous duchess become the children of the king. It was the summit of the family's astonishing ascent. The blood of the Luxembourg duchess and the once poor knight raised to the steps of the throne itself. Princes and princesses of the royal house. But the heights of royalty in that age were the most dangerous heights of all, and the fate of those royal grandchildren would be among the darkest of the whole dark story of the wars, though that lay beyond Jacquetta's own lifetime. The sons of a king were the most precious and the most threatened persons in the realm, and in the deadly turns of dynastic fortune that followed Edward's death, the royal children of Jacquetta's line would meet a fate that has haunted the imagination ever since. Jacquetta did not live to see it, dying before the storm that would engulf her grandchildren broke. She knew them only in the years of their glory, the royal children of her daughter, the Queen. But it is part of the shadow over her story, the knowledge of what would come, that the grandchildren she saw raised so high were destined for so dark an end. The blood she had seen lifted to the throne marked, even then, for tragedy. But to understand what happened to Elizabeth and to her mother, we must turn to the great convulsion that was tearing England apart in these years, the long and bloody dynastic struggle that later ages would call the Wars of the Roses. For the English crown had fallen into dispute between two branches of the royal house, the line of Lancaster, which held the throne in the person of the gentle and increasingly broken King Henry VI, and the rival line of York, which pressed its own claim and gathered its own armies. The realm split, the great families taking sides, and the quarrel was fought out in a series of battles up and down the country. A savage and a shifting conflict in which fortunes rose and fell with the tide of war, and men were killed and attainted and dispossessed as the wheel turned. Into this maelstrom the Woodvilles were drawn, as every family of standing was drawn, and their loyalties at the start were clear, for Jacquetta and her husband were Lancastrians. Bound to the house of Lancaster by every tie of past and interest, the quarrel that became the Wars of the Roses had its roots in a failure at the very top of the kingdom, in the tragic inadequacy of the king. Henry VI, the infant who had inherited two crowns, had grown into a gentle, pious, well-meaning man who was utterly unfit to rule, prone to bouts of a deep mental illness in which he fell into a stupor and knew no one, and incapable, even at his best, of governing the hard men around him or holding the balance between them. A kingdom needed a strong king to keep its powerful lords in order, and Henry was the opposite of strong, and into the vacuum of his weakness, the ambitions and the rivalries of the nobility came flooding. Factions formed around the throne, competing for power and for control of the feeble king, and the chief of these gathered around the king's own kinsman, Richard, Duke of York, who had a claim to the throne of his own, and a growing sense that he, not the favourites around Henry, should govern. What began as a struggle for control of the government slid, by degrees, into a struggle for the crown itself. As the quarrel hardened and blood was shed, and neither side could any longer trust the other, the House of Lancaster, the line of the reigning king, and the House of York, the line of his over-mighty kinsman, became the poles of a deepening conflict, and the noble families of England ranged themselves on one side or the other, by interest and by kinship and by old loyalty. The result was a series of wars fought over some 30 years, in which the crown itself changed hands more than once. Kings were made and unmade and killed, and the nobility tore itself apart in a long dynastic bloodletting. This was the storm into which Jacquetta and her family were drawn, the great quarrel of Lancaster and York, and it would carry them from the losing side to the winning one, and very nearly to destruction, before it was done. Jacquetta's loyalty to Lancaster ran deep and old, for it was the House of Lancaster she had married into all those years before, the house of Henry V and the Duke of Bedford, and she had a personal closeness to the Lancastrian queen besides. That queen was Margaret of Anjou, the fierce and embattled wife of King Henry VI, and Jacquetta was related to her by marriage and stood high in her favour, one of the grand ladies of the Lancastrian court. So when the wars came, the Woodville stood with Lancaster Richard, fighting for King Henry's cause, the family bound to the Red Rose. But the tide of war is a cruel and a fickle thing, and it was about to turn against the House of Lancaster with shattering force, and to carry the Woodvilles, willing or not, toward the rival camp they had opposed. The battle that did it was fought in a snowstorm in the north of England, and it was one of the bloodiest ever fought on English soil. The Lancastrian queen, to whom Jacquetta was so close, Margaret of Anjou, was one of the most formidable women of the age, and the bond between the two noble ladies is worth understanding. Margaret was a French princess who had been married to the gentle King Henry VI, and as her husband proved more and more incapable, it was Margaret who took up the defence of his crown and his cause with a fierce and tireless energy, becoming the real leader of the Lancastrian party in the wars. She was proud, determined, and utterly committed to preserving the throne for her husband and her son, a warrior queen in all but name. And she gathered the loyal lords and ladies of Lancaster about her. Jacquetta, kin to Margaret by marriage and one of the senior ladies of the court, stood high in this Lancastrian circle, close to the embattled queen, bound to her cause. The court of Margaret of Anjou, in the years before the wars destroyed it, was the setting of Jacquetta's prime, and she was one of its great ornaments. It was a court of splendour and of mounting tension, for as the king's weakness deepened and the factions gathered, the queen's circle became the heart of the Lancastrian cause, a court of loyal lords and ladies rallying around the embattled crown. Jacquetta, with her rank and her royal kinship and her closeness to the queen, stood high in this circle, a senior lady of the Lancastrian court, sharing in its ceremonies and its councils, and increasingly its dangers. These were the years of her established greatness, before the catastrophe, when she was simply one of the first ladies of a court that still, for all its troubles, held the throne. We should picture her in these years as a woman at the height of her settled life, a noble lady of middle years, mother of a large family, intimate of the queen, secure in her place at the centre of the Lancastrian world. She had weathered the scandal of her marriage long before and risen above it. Her husband was prospering, her children were growing toward their own futures, and she herself was a figure of consequence at the royal court. It was from this height of Lancastrian eminence that the wars would cast her down, forcing her, after the ruin of the cause she had served and the queen she had loved, to make her peace with the enemy and begin again under the House of York. But before that fall, there were these years of greatness at Margaret's court, the final good seal upon a life that had already known one great rise and would know, after a terrible reversal, another. The royal court at which Jacquetta shone in these years was a place of ceremony and splendour, and it is worth conjuring something of its texture, for it was the natural element of her greatness. A splendid court was a place of display, where rank was made visible in dress and precedence, and the elaborate forms of courtesy, where the day was ordered by ritual and the splendid occasions marked by feasting and pageantry and the giving of gifts. The nobility gathered there to be near the fount of favour, to see and be seen, to pursue the business of advancement and alliance that was the real work of the court beneath its glittering surface. It was a realm of beauty and of intrigue together, of magnificence and of the constant manoeuvring for place and power. Jacquetta moved in this world as one of its foremost figures, a lady of the highest rank, versed in its forms and its arts, at home amid its ceremony and its intrigue. She had known the courts of 3 reigns and 2 kingdoms, the court of the English Regency in France, the court of Lancaster, and in time, the court of York, and she carried herself through all of them with the bearing of her rank, a grand lady among the foremost ladies. The splendour and the ritual that we might find merely decorative were to her the natural expression of the order she belonged to, the visible form of the rank and the precedence that meant so much in her world. To picture Jacquetta truly is to picture her in this element amid the ceremony and the magnificence of a grand court, a figure of consequence moving through the ritual world of the high nobility. As much at home there as in the country quiet of Grafton, the two poles of a noble lady's life. So Jacquetta's loyalty to Lancaster was not a cold matter of interest, but a thing of personal closeness and long attachment, rooted in her first marriage into the royal house and in her friendship with the Queen. She had been a Lancastrian for 30 years, since the day she married Bedford, and her place was among the great ladies who surrounded Margaret of Anjou and upheld the cause of King Henry. This makes the turn that her family later took, the switch to the rival House of York, the more striking and the more difficult, for it meant abandoning not only a side but a queen to whom she had been close, and a loyalty she had held all her adult life. When the tide of war forced the Woodvilles to make their peace with York, Jacquetta was turning away from her own past, from the house and the queen she had served so long, a hard thing for a woman of her loyalty and pride, done because the alternative was ruin. That battle was Towton, fought in the spring of 1461, a vast and terrible clash in driving snow that ended in the crushing defeat of the Lancastrian army and the triumph of York. After Towton, the Lancastrian cause lay in ruins. King Henry a fugitive, and then a prisoner, Queen Margaret driven into exile, and the young and vigorous Yorkist claimant crowned as King Edward IV. For families that had backed the losing side, the defeat meant ruin or submission, and the Woodvilles, like many others, had to make their peace with the New Yorkist king or be destroyed. So Jacquetta and Richard bent to the changed world. They submitted to Edward, were pardoned and received into his peace, and began, cautiously, to find their place in the new order. It was a hard turn for a family so long loyal to Lancaster, this bending of the knee to the house they had fought, but it was the price of survival, and they paid it. They could not have guessed how completely their fortunes were about to be transformed, nor that the instrument of that transformation would be the beautiful widowed daughter, Elizabeth. Towton has a terrible place in the memory of these wars, for it is reckoned among the largest and bloodiest battles ever fought on English soil. A loss of life on a scale that staggered the age. It was fought on a bleak day of driving snow, in the cold of a late winter. Two great armies meeting in the open country and grinding at each other for hours in the storm, until at last the Lancastrian line broke and the rout began. The killing in the rout and the pursuit was immense, for there was little mercy given, and the chroniclers spoke of the dead lying thick across the fields and the streams running red, of losses so heavy that they were scarcely to be believed. Whatever the true numbers, and they cannot now be known with certainty, Towton was a catastrophe for the House of Lancaster. A defeat so complete that it broke the Lancastrian cause for years and set the Yorkist Edward firmly on the throne. For families like the Woodvilles, who had stood with Lancaster, the meaning of Towton was stark and immediate. The cause they had served was shattered, and they must submit to the victor or be destroyed. There was no shame peculiar to them in this, for it was the common reckoning that faced every Lancastrian after so total a defeat. The choice between making peace with the new king and facing ruin, attainder, the loss of lands and life. Jacquetta and Richard, like many others, chose to submit. They came into King Edward, sought and received his pardon, and bent themselves to the New Yorkist order. It was the prudent course, the only course for those who wished to survive and keep their place. But it was a bitter one for a family of such long Lancastrian loyalty. The bending of the knee to the house they had fought. They could not have imagined, as they made their submission, that within a few years this same Yorkist king would be their son-in-law, and their family the first in the land. The submission to the new Yorkist king was a humbling and a careful business, the kind of bending that the losers in such wars had to perform if they wished to keep their lives and lands. To submit was to come before the victor to acknowledge him as king, to seek his pardon for having fought against him, and to give whatever assurances of future loyalty were required. It was the formal abasement of the defeated before the triumphant. The price of being allowed to live and keep one's place. For a family of long Lancastrian loyalty like the Woodvilles, it meant a public reversal, the open abandonment of the cause they had served, and the acknowledgement of the house they had opposed. A swallowing of pride and of past allegiance in the name of survival. It was a precarious business too, for the pardon of a victor was not always to be trusted, and the submitted enemy lived, at least at first, under suspicion, his loyalty doubted, his future uncertain. The Woodvilles had to prove themselves to the new regime, to show that their submission was genuine and their loyalty to be relied on, before they could hope to be received into real favour. That they managed this, and more than managed it, rising under York to greater heights than they had ever known under Lancaster, is a measure of their adaptability, and soon, of the astonishing stroke of fortune that was their daughter's royal marriage. But at the moment of submission, none of that could be foreseen. There was only the hard necessity of bending to the victor, the anxious beginning of a new life under the house they had fought, the uncertain first step on a road that would lead, by ways none could have predicted, to the throne itself. The deadly weapon that the victors in these wars held over the vanquished was the attainder, and it is worth understanding. For it was the sword that hung over every family that had backed a losing side. To be attainted was to be condemned by Act of Parliament as a traitor, and the consequences were ruinous. The forfeiture of all one's lands and goods to the crown, the loss of one's titles and one's standing, and the corruption of one's blood, so that one's heirs could not inherit. An attainted family was stripped and ruined, cast down from whatever height it had held, its wealth seized and its future destroyed, and the threat of it was the great terror that the wars held for the nobility. The price of having chosen wrongly in the deadly game of dynastic loyalty. This is what the Woodvilles, like every Lancastrian family, faced after the defeat of their cause, the danger of attainder and ruin, and it is why their submission to the victorious king was so necessary and so anxious a business. To make one's peace with the new regime, to be pardoned and received into its favour, was to escape the attainder that would otherwise have destroyed one, to save one's lands and one's standing and one's family's future. The Woodvilles managed this, and managed it so well that they rose, in the end, higher than ever. But the danger had been real, the abyss of attainder and ruin gaping beneath them in the aftermath of defeat. Jacquetta lived her whole later life in a world where this weapon existed, where families were made and unmade by Act of Parliament, where a turn of dynastic fortune could strip the greatest house of everything, and where survival meant the careful, anxious management of one's loyalty to whoever held the throne. It was a world of high stakes and sudden ruin, and the Woodvilles played it, for many years, with conspicuous success, until Warwick's coup brought the ruin they had so long escaped. For the young King Edward IV, handsome and amorous and not yet married, met Elizabeth Woodville and was captivated by her, and what followed was the most astonishing royal marriage of the age. By the famous account, Elizabeth would not become the king's mistress, holding out for honourable marriage against all the odds, and Edward, smitten past prudence, agreed to marry her, a widow, a commoner by royal standards, the daughter of a family lately Lancastrian, and he married her in secret, telling no one, in a quiet ceremony with almost no witnesses, an act as reckless in its way as Jacquetta's own secret marriage had been a generation before. By the tradition that has come down to us, the only member of the bride's family present at that secret wedding, the one who stood witness as a king married her daughter, was Jacquetta herself. Whether the detail is exactly true, we cannot be certain. But it is fitting, almost too fitting, that the Duchess, who had once married for love in secret, should stand beside her daughter as she did the same, and married not a knight this time, but the King of England. The wheel had come full circle, and Jacquetta's blood was about to be raised higher than ever, for her daughter was now, secretly, the Queen. Edward IV was, in every way, a contrast to the broken king he had replaced. A tall, vigorous, handsome young man, a soldier who had won his crown in battle, and a ruler of real ability and charm, though given to pleasure and to women. He was the kind of king the age admired, strong and splendid and personally formidable, and his marriage was a matter of the highest political importance, for a king's marriage was an instrument of foreign alliance, the sealing of a treaty, the winning of a friend among the powers of Europe. It was expected as a matter of course that Edward would marry a foreign princess, and negotiations to that end were in fact underway, his great councillors working to arrange a grand continental match that would strengthen the realm. For the king to marry instead an English widow of modest rank, secretly and for love, was to throw all of this away, to spurn the policy of his advisers and the expectations of his crown. The secrecy and the suddenness of the royal marriage echoed Jacquetta's own match so closely that one can hardly believe it was not, in part, her daughter following where she had led. Like her mother before her, Elizabeth married in secret, without the public negotiation and ceremony that a marriage of such moment demanded, presenting the world with an accomplished fact. Like her mother, she married for love and against all policy, a splendid match made not for alliance, but for the heart. By the accounts that have come down, the wedding was a quiet and a hidden thing, performed with almost no witnesses, the king slipping away to wed his widow in secret and keeping the match hidden for a time before the truth came out and astonished the kingdom. There is a real question which we cannot answer, of how far Jacquetta guided or encouraged her daughter in this astonishing course. For who better to counsel a secret marriage for love than the woman who had made one herself a generation before? By the tradition that has come down, Jacquetta was present at the secret wedding, the one member of the bride's family there to witness it, and it is hard not to see her hand, or at least her sympathy, in a match that so exactly repeated her own defiance of the rules. Whether she planned it or merely blessed it, the secret royal marriage was the daughter walking in the mother's footsteps, the second great love match of the family, even bolder than the first, and Jacquetta stood beside her daughter as she made it, as perhaps no one else could have done with such understanding. So the secret marriage was not only a romance, but a political folly of the first order, an act that astonished and dismayed the king's councillors and changed the course of his reign. It threw away the diplomatic advantage of a foreign match. It raised up a family of no great rank to the heights of the kingdom, and it humiliated the leading men who had been labouring to arrange a different marriage entirely. That Edward did it anyway, against all advice and all interest, for the love of a beautiful widow who would not have him on other terms, tells us something of his character, the same headstrong following of desire that marked his whole reign. And it tells us, too, that the pattern of Jacquetta's own life, the marriage made for love against all policy, was repeating itself in her daughter on an even grander stage, with even greater consequences. For this time, the reckless lover was the King of England himself. There is a deeper reason why the charge that would later be raised against Jacquetta, that she had bewitched the king into the marriage, was so grave a matter, and it lies in the way that age regarded the person of the king. The king was not merely a powerful man, but a sacred and an anointed figure, set apart by his coronation and his anointing, the head of the realm and the deputy, as the thinking of the age held, of God in his kingdom. To work upon the king by sorcery, to bend his will by unnatural arts, was therefore not merely a private crime, but an assault upon the very order of the realm, a tampering with the sacred person on whom the whole kingdom depended. The bewitching of a king was among the gravest sorceries imaginable, a crime against the state and against the divine order both. This is why the specific form of the accusation against Jacquetta, that she had made images to compel the king into marrying her daughter, was so deadly a charge, for it struck at the king's sacred will and the order of the succession together. If the king had been bewitched into his marriage, then the marriage itself was tainted, the product of unnatural compulsion rather than royal will, and the children of it might be held illegitimate, the whole succession poisoned at its source. This was exactly the use that would be made of the charge years later when it was revived to bastardize the king's children. The accusation of sorcery against the marriage was a way of attacking the legitimacy of the royal line itself. To accuse Jacquetta of bewitching the king was thus to reach for one of the most dangerous charges the age could frame, a charge that threatened not only her life, but the standing of her daughter, the queen, and the legitimacy of the royal grandchildren. It was a weapon aimed at the whole greatness of her family, through the sacred person of the king. When the secret came out, and it could not stay secret long, the effect was sensational, and the entire standing of the Woodville family was transformed overnight. The king had married not a foreign princess, as kings were expected to do, but an Englishwoman of modest rank, and her family, lately of the losing side, was suddenly the family of the queen. What followed was a dazzling rise. As Edward showered favour on his new wife's relations, and the Woodvilles climbed, in a few short years, from the middling nobility to the very heights of the realm. Jacquetta's husband Richard was raised to be Earl Rivers, made a high officer of state, lifted into the front rank of the peerage. Her many sons and daughters were advanced and enriched, and above all married brilliantly, for a queen's brothers and sisters were prizes in the marriage market. And the Woodvilles made a series of splendid matches that tied them to the greatest families in England. The large brood that Jacquetta had borne her knight now became the foundation of a mighty connection, the queen's kin spreading through the nobility, and Jacquetta herself, mother of the queen, stood at the centre of it all, the matriarch of the most suddenly powerful family in the kingdom. The specific honours heaped upon the family give the measure of the transformation, for the Woodvilles went from the middling nobility to the front rank of the kingdom in a handful of years. Jacquetta's husband Richard, the once poor knight, was raised to be Earl Rivers, given a great title, and then high office, made in time the Treasurer of England and Constable, lifted into the very summit of the realm's government. The sons were advanced and enriched, the eldest becoming a nobleman of the first rank in his own right. And the daughters and the younger sons were married, brilliantly and rapidly, into the greatest families of England. A whole series of matches that tied the Queen's kin to the old nobility and spread the Woodville connection through the peerage. There is a particular irony worth savouring in the elevation of Richard Woodville, the once poor knight, to the great offices of Earl Rivers and Treasurer and Constable of England. Here was the man whose marriage to Jacquetta had scandalised a kingdom, who had been fined a fortune for daring to wed so far above himself, raised now to the front rank of the nobility and to the highest offices of the realm, the father-in-law of the king. The knight who had been deemed unworthy of a duchess was become an earl and a chief officer of state, his blood mingled with the royal line through his daughter the queen. His sons and daughters marrying into the greatest houses. The established order of rank that had been so outraged by his marriage to Jacquetta had been overturned in his favour, and the upstart knight stood among the mightiest men in England. For Jacquetta, this elevation of her husband must have been the sweetest of vindications, the final answer to all who had condemned her marriage. The man she had chosen for love against the full weight of her world, the man she had been fined and shamed for marrying, was now an earl and a great officer, raised by the very royal connection that her own and her daughter's marriages had forged. The choice that had seemed such folly, the throwing away of her rank on a mere night, had turned out to be the foundation of a family raised to the heights of the kingdom. She had married for love and been proved, in the most spectacular fashion, to have married well, for her poor knight was now an earl and the grandfather of princes. It was the height of the family's fortune, and Jacquetta, the bold bride of long ago, had lived to see her gamble crowned with a glory beyond anything she could have hoped. It was this engrossing of honours and rich marriages, more than anything, that turned the old nobility against the family, for there was only so much to go round, and what the Woodvilles took, others felt themselves to have lost. The great marriages were especially resented, for a limited number of wealthy heirs and heiresses came onto the market in any generation, and when the Queen's many siblings swept up a string of the best of them, the noble families who had hoped for those matches felt robbed. The speed and the scale of it all, the sudden elevation of a family that had been nobody a few years before to the first place in the kingdom, offended the pride and the interest of the established lords, who saw upstarts gathering the honours and the heiresses that they regarded as their own due. The rise of the Woodvilles was real and dazzling, but it was bought at the price of deep and dangerous resentment, and that resentment would in time turn deadly. For Jacquetta, it must have been a kind of vindication, the scandalous marriage of long ago now crowned by her daughter's even more astonishing match, her blood raised to share the throne, her children climbing to glory. But such a rise, so swift and so dazzling, breeds enemies as surely as it breeds honours, and the very speed of the Woodville ascendancy stirred deep and dangerous resentment among the older nobility. To the magnates who had backed Edward to the throne and expected to reap the rewards, the sudden engrossing of honours and rich marriages by the Queen's upstart family was a bitter thing. A crowd of newcomers seizing what the old families felt was theirs. The Woodvilles were envied and resented and called grasping upstarts, and the more they rose, the more the resentment gathered, until it focused with terrible force on one man above all, the greatest of the lords who felt himself wronged, the man who had made Edward king and now found himself eclipsed by the Queen's relations. The grievance of the old nobility against the Woodvilles was not mere snobbery, though there was plenty of that, but a real political grievance about power and patronage, and it is worth understanding on its own terms. In the system of the age, the king ruled through the powerful men of the realm, and the honours and offices and profitable marriages at his disposal were the currency by which he rewarded and bound them to him. When a king lavished this currency on a single family, and a newly risen one at that, he upset the balance, for what went to the favoured family did not go to the others, and the great lords who felt themselves the natural recipients of royal favour saw it diverted to upstarts. They were not wrong to feel that the king was overturning the proper order, raising the low and slighting the high, and concentrating his favour where it bred envy, rather than spreading it where it bought loyalty. So the resentment of the Woodvilles was in part a sound political instinct, a sense that the king was misusing his patronage and storing up trouble, and not only the spite of proud men against their inferiors, but it was sharpened, beyond doubt, by the sting of rank, by the affront that men of the oldest blood felt at bowing to a family lately of the gentry, raised by a marriage they thought beneath the dignity of the crown. The two things together, the real grievance about power and the wounded pride of rank, made a powerful and a bitter brew. And it gathered around the Woodvilles a weight of hostility that their wealth and their royal connection could not dispel. They were the most envied family in England, and envy on that scale, in an age of armed and violent lords, was a dangerous thing to attract. Jacquetta, at the centre of the family, shared in both its glory and the peril that its glory was breeding. That man was Richard Neville, Earl of Warwick, whom later ages would call the Kingmaker, and he was the mightiest nobleman in England. The chief architect of the Yorkist triumph, accustomed to standing first in the king's councils. Warwick had set Edward on the throne and expected to govern through him, to guide the young king and reap the harvest of his own king-making, and for a time he did. But the rise of the Woodvilles cut directly across his power, for the Queen's family took the honours and the marriages and the influence that Warwick felt should flow through him. And worse, the king began to follow his own course and his wife's family's counsel rather than Warwick's. The mighty Earl found himself thwarted and slighted, his power waning as the upstarts waxed, and his resentment hardened into something deadly. A proud and mighty man who feels himself robbed of his due is a dangerous enemy, and Warwick was the most powerful subject in the land. The stage was being set for a violent reckoning, and when it came, the Woodvilles and Jacquetta among them would be terribly exposed. To understand the danger the Woodvilles were in, we must understand the sheer scale of Warwick's power. For he was no ordinary lord, but the mightiest subject England had seen in generations. The Nevilles were a vast and a grasping family who had risen to dominate the north of England, and Richard Neville had added to his inheritance the enormous estates of the earldom of Warwick through his marriage, until he commanded lands and castles and retainers on a scale that rivaled the crown itself. He could raise armies from his own affinity, the great network of men bound to him by service and reward. He held the keeping of Calais and commanded the sea. He had been the chief architect of the Yorkist victory and Edward's accession, the man more than any other who had made the young king. Accustomed to this greatness, and to the role of the king's chief counsellor and partner in power, Warwick expected to go on governing through the king he had raised. There is a bitter dimension to the enmity between Warwick and the Woodvilles, for the two families had not always been foes, and Warwick's hatred had the special venom of a man who felt himself betrayed by those he had helped. In the rise of the House of York, Warwick and the Woodvilles had been on the same side. It was Warwick's cause that had triumphed at Towton, and the Woodvilles had submitted and been received into the Yorkist peace, partly through the settlement that Warwick's victory had made. There had even been ties of marriage and alliance binding the families into the wider Yorkist connection. For a time, they were not enemies, but members of the same victorious party. The powerful Earl and the rising family both gathered under the banner of King Edward. It was the king's marriage and the Woodville ascendancy that turned alliance into enmity, that made Warwick feel himself supplanted by the very family that had risen, in part, under the settlement he had made. The sense of betrayal sharpened his resentment, for it is one thing to be opposed by an old enemy, and another to be eclipsed by those one had counted as friends and inferiors. Warwick had expected to be the first man in the kingdom, the partner and guide of the king he had made, and instead he found himself elbowed aside by the Queen's upstart relations, the family he may once have patronised now soaring above him. That reversal, that sense of having raised up those who now displaced him, gave his hatred its peculiar bitterness. And it was a hatred that would not be satisfied until the Woodville men were dead, and Jacquetta herself stood accused of witchcraft. The enmity that destroyed the family was the enmity of a former ally turned deadly foe. The rise of the Woodvilles struck directly at all of this, and Warwick felt it as a personal affront and a political defeat. The honours and marriages that the Queen's family engrossed were honours and marriages that did not come to the Nevilles. The king's growing habit of following his own counsel and his wife's family's advice cut Warwick out of the central place he thought his due. And there was a particular and a stinging humiliation. For Warwick had been deep in the negotiation of a foreign marriage for Edward, labouring to arrange a French match, when the king's secret marriage to Elizabeth Woodville cut the ground from under him and made his diplomacy ridiculous. The greatest man in the kingdom found himself thwarted, slighted, and made a fool of, his power waning as the upstarts waxed, and his pride and his ambition both demanded a reckoning. A man of his might, nursing such grievances, was the most dangerous enemy imaginable, and it was upon the Woodvilles that his anger was fixed. The reckoning came in the year 1469, when Warwick, his patience exhausted and his ambition turned to treason, rose against the king he had made. He stirred up rebellion, gathered his forces, and in the confusion of the rising, the royal army was defeated, and King Edward himself fell into Warwick's hands, taken and held a prisoner, while the Earl tried to rule the kingdom in his name. It was a stunning reversal. The king, a captive of his overmighty subject, the whole Yorkist settlement thrown into chaos. And in that chaos, the Woodvilles were horribly vulnerable, for they were the objects of Warwick's particular hatred, the upstarts he most wished to destroy. And now the king, who might have protected them, was a prisoner and could protect no one. The family that had risen so high so fast was suddenly defenceless, its royal shield struck away, at the mercy of the man who hated it most. And Warwick showed no mercy. The rebellion of that year was a carefully prepared stroke, for Warwick did not rise as a simple rebel, but moved against the king with cunning and with allies, including, astonishingly, the king's own treacherous brother. He stirred up risings in the north to draw the king's forces, put about complaints against the king's evil counsellors, by which he meant chiefly the Woodvilles, and gathered his own great power. So that when the blow fell, it fell hard. A royal force was met and defeated at a battle in the Midlands, at Edgecote. And in the wake of that defeat, the king found himself with too few men about him, and was taken into Warwick's custody, a prisoner in the hands of the man who had made him. For a few months, Warwick held the king, and tried to rule in his name, the overmighty subject become the master of the kingdom, the strangest of reversals. It was in the chaos of this seizure of power that the Woodvilles were destroyed. For with the king a captive, there was no shield between them and the enemy who hated them most. The protection that had lifted them so high was struck away in an instant. The king, who was their kinsman and their patron, could do nothing for them, and Warwick was free to wreak his will. The family that had been first in the land found itself suddenly defenceless, scattered and exposed, its head and its members at the mercy of a man who had every reason to want them dead. This is the hinge of Jacquetta's tragedy, the moment when the dazzling rise turned, with terrible speed, into ruin, when the gathering resentment of years broke at last into open violence, and the Woodvilles paid the price of having climbed so high, so fast, and the first to pay with their lives were the men closest to Jacquetta of all. For Warwick's men had taken Jacquetta's husband, Richard Woodville, Earl Rivers, and one of her sons, John Woodville, and Warwick had them put to death. There was no proper trial, no due process of law. In the disorder of his brief ascendancy, Warwick simply had the two Woodville men executed, killed to strike at the family he loathed, and to remove the chief of the Queen's kin. So Jacquetta, in a single blow, lost the husband she had defied a kingdom to marry, the knight she had loved for more than 30 years, and a son besides, both of them killed by the order of a mighty lord against whom she had no recourse. It is hard to imagine the grief and the terror of it, the Duchess, who had risen so high, seeing her husband and her son struck down by an enemy who held the king himself a prisoner. Her family's glory turned in an instant to mourning and peril. And her ordeal was not over, for Warwick, having destroyed the Woodville men, now turned his malice upon Jacquetta herself, and reached for the oldest and most dangerous weapon that could be used against a woman, the charge of witchcraft. The killing of Earl Rivers and his son was murder under the colour of authority, a thing done outside all law in the brief lawlessness of Warwick's ascendancy. There was no trial worth the name, no due process, no charge proved before a court. In the disorder that followed the defeat at Edgecote, the two Woodville men were simply seized and put to death on Warwick's order, killed because they were the chief of the family he meant to destroy, and because, with the king a prisoner, there was no power to stop him. It was the kind of extrajudicial killing that the breakdown of order made possible, the strong taking the lives of their enemies because they could, and it was a stark demonstration of how thin the protections of law and rank became when power itself was contested and the king could not enforce his peace. For Jacquetta the blow was shattering on every level, for it took from her, in a single stroke, the husband of more than 30 years and one of her sons. Richard Woodville was the man she had defied a kingdom to marry, the knight she had loved across the wide gulf of rank, her partner through the many decades of their rise. And now he was dead, killed by an enemy against whom she had no recourse, his life taken without law or mercy. To lose him so, and a son with him, would have been agony for any woman. And Jacquetta bore it stripped of every defence, her family's power broken, her royal protector a captive, herself exposed to whatever further malice her enemies chose. It was the cruelest passage of her life, the murder of the man she had given everything to marry, and it came, as we shall see, with a further horror close behind. For Warwick was not content to have killed the Woodville men, but meant to strike at Jacquetta herself. The grief of a widow in that age had its forms and its observances, and Jacquetta, who had now lost the husband of more than 30 years, would have mourned him in the ways her world prescribed. There were the rites of the church, the prayers and the masses for the soul of the dead, the offices that surrounded death and burial, and that gave grief its shape and its consolation, and there was the long mourning that custom required, the withdrawal and the black and the visible signs of loss. For a woman of faith, and Jacquetta was of her pious age, these observances were not empty forms, but the true expression of grief and the means of seeking comfort, the commending of the beloved dead to God, and the long work of mourning carried on in prayer. But Jacquetta's grief was sharpened beyond the ordinary by the manner of her husband's death and by the peril of her own position, for Richard Woodville had not died in his bed, full of years, but had been killed, murdered without law by the family's enemy, and his widow had no leisure to mourn in peace. She grieved under threat, her husband and son struck down, and herself exposed to the malice that would soon bring the charge of witchcraft against her, mourning and endangered at once. It was the cruelest of bereavements, the loss of the man she had loved and chosen against all the world in such a manner and at such a time, with no security even to grieve him. The marriage that had been the great romance and the long happiness of her life ended not in the quiet death of an old husband, but in murder and peril. And Jacquetta was left to mourn the knight she had given everything for, amid the ruin of her family and the shadow of the scaffold and the accusation. The speed of the family's fall is one of the most striking things about it. For the Woodvilles passed from the very summit of the kingdom to ruin and bereavement in a matter of weeks, almost overnight. One season they were the first family in the land, the Queen's kin, laden with honours and offices, the matriarch standing second only to her daughter among all the ladies of England. The next, the king was a captive, the head of the family, and one of his sons were dead, murdered without law, and the matriarch herself stood accused of witchcraft and brought a prisoner to her enemy's castle. There was no slow decline, no gradual loss of fortune, but a sudden plunge from the heights to the depths, the work of a single turn of the wheel of dynastic fortune. This suddenness was the very nature of fortune in that age, and the people of the time felt it keenly, the sense that no height was secure, that the wheel was always turning. that those at the top might be cast down in an instant by the violence of the times. The Woodvilles had risen with dizzying speed, and they fell with the same speed, and Jacquetta lived through both the rise and the fall, the dazzling ascent and the sudden ruin within the span of a few short years. It is a story that the medieval mind would have read as a perfect illustration of the turning of fortune's wheel, the eminent raised high only to be thrown down, the lesson of the instability of all earthly greatness written in the fate of a single family. For Jacquetta, it was no lesson, but a lived catastrophe, the world of her triumph collapsing about her in a season. Her husband and son dead, and herself accused, the height and the abyss separated by the briefest of intervals. Few lives show the turning of the wheel so starkly as hers. The accusation, when it came, was brought by a man named Thomas Wake, an esquire and a follower of Warwick, and it was as cynical as it was dangerous. Wake produced an object, a small image made of lead, fashioned, he said, in the likeness of a man-at-arms, about the length of a man's finger, broken in the middle and bound together again with a wire. This little broken figure, he claimed, had been made by Jacquetta, the Duchess of Bedford, for the working of witchcraft and sorcery, an instrument of the dark arts. And there was more, for Wake sought to draw in a parish clerk named John Dornger, of the village of Stoke-Bruerne, to swear that the Duchess had made 2 further images, one fashioned for the king and one for the queen. The implication was plain and deadly, that Jacquetta had used sorcery to work upon King Edward, to bewitch him into his marriage with her daughter Elizabeth. That the whole astonishing royal match had been brought about, not by the king's desire, but by the unnatural arts of the bride's mother. It was an accusation perfectly designed to destroy her, and to taint the queen and the royal marriage along with her, and it was brought at the moment when Jacquetta had no protector left to shield her. To feel the weight of this accusation, we must understand how the people of that age regarded witchcraft, for it was no trivial charge but a matter of real and dreadful seriousness. They lived in a world that believed in the reality of unseen powers, in the possibility of working harm or compelling events through hidden arts, through spells and images, and the secret invocation of dark forces. To practice such arts, what the law called maleficium, the working of harm by sorcery, was both a crime and a sin, an offence against the king's peace and against God, and a charge of it carried a terrible danger. For it was hard to disprove and easy to believe, and it touched the deepest fears of the age. A person accused of witchcraft stood in real peril, for the accusation fed on suspicion and rumour, and once the whisper was abroad, it was hard to silence. The particular form the charge took, the making of images, drew on one of the most widely feared kinds of sorcery, the working of magic through figures fashioned in the likeness of a victim. It was a common belief that a sorcerer could harm or influence a person by making an image of them and working upon it, and that such images, especially when broken or pierced or bound, were instruments of deadly magic. So the broken lead figure that Thomas Wake produced, the little man-at-arms snapped in the middle and bound with wire, was meant to be read at once as a tool of witchcraft, and the further claim that Jacquetta had made images of the king and queen pointed to the most alarming sorcery of all, the bewitching of the sovereign himself. It was an accusation crafted to play upon every fear the age held about magic, and to make the Duchess seem a worker of the darkest arts, and against the background of her family's fall and the old whisper of her serpent ancestress. It was a charge designed to be believed, for we must see how defenceless she was in that hour, and how cunningly the timing was chosen. Her husband and her son lay dead by Warwick's order. Her son-in-law the king was Warwick's prisoner, able to help no one. The whole Woodville power that had risen so high was scattered and broken, and Jacquetta stood alone, a grieving widow stripped of every defence, exactly when the charge of sorcery was laid against her. To be accused of witchcraft was a grave and a frightening thing for any woman of that age, for it was a crime that touched both the law and the soul, and a charge that, once made, was hard to wash away, and for it to be made against a woman whose protectors were dead or imprisoned was as perilous a position as could be imagined. And in the background, we may be sure, lay the old whisper of the Luxembourg descent from Melusine the serpent woman, the fairy blood in her line, ready to be murmured against her, to make the charge of sorcery seem to fit a woman of such strange and ancient origins. Jacquetta was arrested and brought to Warwick's stronghold. The Duchess, who had stood so high, now a prisoner, facing a charge that could have ended in her ruin. The charge of witchcraft was, in that age and for centuries after, a weapon peculiarly suited to the destruction of women, and its use against Jacquetta fits a long and a grim pattern. A powerful or a prominent woman, a woman who had risen high or exercised influence or simply made enemies, was vulnerable to the whisper of sorcery in a way that a man was not. For the charge fed on the suspicion that a woman's power must have some hidden and unnatural source. Other grand ladies of the age had been brought down by accusations of witchcraft, and the pattern was always similar. That a charge raised at a moment of political vulnerability, the woman's influence reframed as sorcery, her downfall achieved through the dread that the accusation stirred. It was a way of striking at a woman who could not easily be reached by other means, of turning her very prominence into the evidence against her. Jacquetta fitted the pattern almost too well, and her enemies surely knew it. She was a woman who had risen extraordinarily high, the mother of the Queen, the matriarch of the most envied family in England. She had made powerful enemies, and she carried, in the old legend of her house, a ready-made association with the uncanny, the descent from the serpent woman Melusine that could be murmured to make the charge of sorcery seem to fit. All of this made her an ideal target for the weapon of witchcraft, a woman whose fall could be achieved by playing on the fears the accusation aroused. That the charge was cynical, raised by a follower of Warwick at the precise moment of her greatest weakness, with her men dead and her protector a captive, only underlines how deliberately the weapon was chosen and aimed. It was not that anyone truly believed the Duchess a witch. It was that the charge of witchcraft was the surest way to destroy a great and vulnerable woman, and her enemies reached for it accordingly. Jacquetta had, moreover, a vivid and a recent example before her of how a lady of rank could be destroyed by a charge of witchcraft, for such a thing had befallen another duchess within her own court world. In years she had lived through. A duchess of the highest rank, the wife of a mighty prince of the royal house, had some years before been accused of resorting to sorcery and forbidden arts, of conspiring through magic to compass the death of the king and bring her own husband nearer to the throne. The charge had brought her down utterly. She was made to do public penance, walking through the streets of London in shame for all to see. Her marriage was dissolved, and she was imprisoned for the rest of her life. An eminent lady, cast down from the heights to ruin and lifelong captivity by the deadly weapon of a witchcraft accusation. This case, which had unfolded within Jacquetta's own lifetime, and in the court circles she knew, was a vivid demonstration of how the charge of sorcery could be used to destroy a woman of the very highest rank, how no eminence was protection against it, how a duchess of the blood could be brought to public shame and lifelong imprisonment on such a charge. Jacquetta would have known of it well, perhaps known the woman herself, and when the charge of witchcraft was raised against her own person years later, she would have understood with terrible clarity what such an accusation could do, having seen it done. The weapon that was turned against her was no novelty, but a known and a proven instrument of destruction, one that had already brought down a great lady of her acquaintance, and she faced it, knowing exactly how deadly it could be. That she came through it, cleared and vindicated where the other duchess had been ruined, was her fortune and the emptiness of the charge together. But she faced it in the shadow of that earlier ruin, knowing the worst that it could do, and yet the case against her collapsed, and it collapsed because it had no substance, and because the wheel of fortune turned once more before it could be pressed home. Warwick's grip on power proved short. He could not, in the end, rule through a captive king, and Edward IV regained his liberty and his throne, and with the king restored, the malicious prosecution of his mother-in-law could not stand. The matter was brought before the king's great council, and there the flimsy structure of the accusation fell apart. The men who were supposed to make the case could not sustain it. The parish clerk Donga, brought to testify, would not say what was wanted of him, declaring that he had heard no witchcraft of the Lady of Bedford, and refusing to swear to the images of the king and queen. There was, in the end, no evidence worth the name, only a broken scrap of lead and the malice of Warwick's faction, and the council saw it for what it was. In January of 1470, Jacquetta was formally cleared of the charges. Exonerated, her name wiped clean of the accusation of sorcery. She had faced the most dangerous charge of her age, at the most defenceless moment of her life, and she had come through it. The collapse of the case turned on the restoration of the king, and on the simple emptiness of the charge, and the details are worth following, for they show how flimsy the whole thing was. When Edward IV recovered his liberty and his throne, the political ground shifted utterly, for now the accused woman was once more the mother-in-law of a king in power, and the matter was referred to the king's great council, a body unlikely to convict the sovereign's kinswoman on the word of his enemies. And when the case was examined, there was nothing to it. The man who was supposed to support the charge, the parish clerk John Donga, would not do so. Brought before the council, he declared that he had heard no witchcraft of the Lady of Bedford, and he refused to swear that there had ever been any images of the king and queen, the very heart of the accusation. The supposed evidence dissolved, the witnesses failed, and the charge stood revealed as the malicious invention it was. It is worth understanding something of how a matter like this was handled, for Jacquetta's clearing came not from a court of law in our sense, but from the king's great council, the body of foremost men who advised the crown and dealt with the weightiest affairs of the realm. When the charge against the king's mother-in-law came to be examined, it was before this council of the great that the matter was laid. A body composed of the leading men of the kingdom, and one that, with the king restored to power, was hardly disposed to convict his kinswoman on the word of his defeated enemies. The examination would have involved a questioning of those who were supposed to support the charge, the testing of their evidence, the weighing of the matter by men of authority, and it was in this examination that the case fell apart, for the supposed witnesses could not sustain what was asked of them. The parish clerk, who was meant to swear to the making of the images, would not do so, declaring that he had heard no witchcraft of the lady, and refusing to support the central claim, and without his testimony, and with no images produced, and no real evidence offered, there was nothing for the charge to rest on. The council, examining the matter, found it empty, and cleared the Duchess of the accusation, a formal vindication by the great men of the realm. It was in its way a fair outcome, the testing of a charge and its rejection for want of evidence. Though we need not doubt that the political wind, now blowing the king's way again, helped the council to see the emptiness of his enemy's accusation. The machinery of the council, examining and weighing and rejecting, gave Jacquetta her vindication, and the malicious charge that had been raised at her most defenceless hour was thrown out by the assembled authority of the kingdom, her name cleared by the very summit of the realm's government. So in January of 1470, the King's Council formally cleared Jacquetta of the charges, and her name was wiped clean of the accusation of sorcery. It was a real vindication, an official finding that the charge was groundless, and it restored her good name in the eyes of the law. But we should not imagine it undid the damage, for the things that had been taken from her could not be given back. Her husband and her son were still dead, and the fear and the grief and the peril of those terrible months could not be unmade by a council's verdict. The exoneration cleared her name, but it came amid ruin, and it was, in a sense, a victory over a charge that should never have been brought, won only because the wheel of fortune had turned the king's way again. Jacquetta was cleared. But she was a widow now, bereft of the husband she had loved and the son she had lost, and the clearing of her name was a cold comfort against so much grief. The clearing of her name was a victory, but it came amid loss and turmoil, and the years that remained to Jacquetta were few and shadowed. She had been exonerated, but her husband and her son were still dead, killed by the enemy whose charge against her had just been thrown down, and the wars were not over. The kingdom was plunged back into chaos when Warwick, his coup against Edward having failed, made an extraordinary alliance with his old Lancastrian enemies and drove Edward briefly from the throne, restoring the broken King Henry VI for a few strange months before the wheel turned yet again, and Edward returned in arms to reclaim his crown. Jacquetta lived through this last convulsion, the brief and bewildering restoration of the broken old king, her daughter driven into the sanctuary of the church to bear her child in hiding, while the throne itself changed hands about them. It was a frightening, upside-down time. The world of her family turned over once more, and she endured it as she had endured so much before, waiting to see which way the wheel would settle. The turmoil through which Jacquetta lived out her last years was among the most chaotic of the whole long wars, a final dizzying turn of the wheel. Warwick, having failed to rule through a captive Edward, did the most extraordinary thing of his extraordinary career. He made peace with his old enemies, the Lancastrians, allied himself with the exiled Queen Margaret of Anjou, whom he had spent years fighting, and returned to England to drive Edward from the throne and restore the broken old king, Henry VI, to a brief and shadowy second reign. For a few strange months, the world was turned upside down. The Yorkist king, a fugitive overseas, and the Lancastrian king set up again, while Elizabeth, Jacquetta's daughter, fled into the sanctuary of the church to escape her enemies, and there, in hiding, bore the son who would one day be king. Jacquetta lived through all of this, the readaptation of the old king, her daughter's flight, the upturning of everything. Then the wheel turned once more, and for the last time, for Edward came back in arms. Defeated and killed Warwick in battle, crushed the Lancastrians utterly, and recovered his throne for good. The great enemy who had murdered her husband and her son, and tried to destroy her as a witch, was himself dead now, killed in the field, and the House of York stood triumphant. Jacquetta saw this final reversal. The fall of the man who had ruined her family and the restoration of her son-in-law, whatever grim satisfaction it brought her, it came near the very end of her own life. For in the spring of 1472, not long after the wars had reached their bloody resolution, Jacquetta died at Grafton, the family seat where she had lived so much of her life, aged about 56. Her burial place is not recorded and is not known to this day, so that the woman who had stood so high passed from life without even a marked grave. Her resting place lost, as so much about her has been lost. To the silence of the record, the final destruction of the Lancastrian cause, which Jacquetta lived to see, was as complete and as bloody as such endings were in those wars. When Edward returned from his brief exile and fought his way back to the throne, he did it in a short and a savage campaign that broke his enemies utterly. Warwick, the great earl who had made and then unmade him, was killed in battle, and soon after, in another field, the last Lancastrian army was destroyed, and the cause that had contended for the crown for a generation was finished. The old Lancastrian king, The gentle and broken Henry VI did not long survive the ruin of his cause. He died in captivity, almost certainly killed, once his son and heir was dead, and he was no longer of any use alive. And with him, the direct line of Lancaster came to its end. So the long wars reached, for a time, a bloody resolution, the House of York triumphant and the House of Lancaster destroyed, and Jacquetta lived just long enough to see it. The final turning of the wheel that had carried her family from Lancaster to York and through ruin to restoration. The queen whom she had once served, Margaret of Anjou, was a captive now, her cause in ruins and her son dead. The king Jacquetta had first been bound to was dead in the Tower. The mighty earl who had murdered her husband was killed in the field. The world of her youth and her first loyalties was swept away in that final Yorkist triumph, and her own family stood among the victors, her son-in-law secure at last upon the throne. It was the settling, for a while, of all the protracted quarrels that had shaped her life, and she saw it in her last year before she went to her own rest at Grafton. The wars of her age reaching their terrible resolution as her own life drew to its close. But the charge of witchcraft, once made, was not so easily buried, and in a grim final twist, it was raised against Jacquetta's name even after her death, when she could no longer answer it. The Yorkist peace did not last. King Edward IV died. His young sons disappeared into the Tower, and his brother seized the crown as King Richard III. To justify his taking of the throne, Richard needed to declare his brother's children illegitimate. And to do that, he needed to discredit the marriage of Edward and Elizabeth Woodville. And so the old slander was dragged out and set down in the very document that proclaimed Richard king. That document, the Act of Parliament that set out his claim, declared the marriage of Edward and Elizabeth invalid, and among its grounds it stated that the match had been brought about by sorcery and witchcraft, worked by Elizabeth and by her mother, Jacquetta. Duchess of Bedford, as it said, was the common report of the people. No proof was offered, then or ever. It was the bare repetition of the old malicious charge, set down as useful slander to bastardize a dead king's children. Jacquetta was years in her grave by then and beyond all harm, but it is a bitter thing that the lie she had been cleared of in life was carved into the record after her death, to serve another man's ambition. The document in which the old slander was revived, the act that proclaimed Richard III's title to the throne, deserves a closer look, for it shows how a private malice could be turned into a public lie of state. When Richard seized the crown after his brother Edward's death, he needed to set aside Edward's sons, the boys who were the rightful heirs. And to do that, he had to destroy the validity of their parents' marriage and brand them illegitimate. The act that set out his claim declared the marriage of Edward and Elizabeth invalid on several grounds, and among them it dragged up the charge that the match had been brought about by sorcery and witchcraft, worked, it said, by Elizabeth and by her mother Jacquetta, as was, it claimed, the common talk of the people. It was the old accusation, the very charge of which Jacquetta had been cleared in her lifetime, exhumed and set down in an Act of Parliament to serve an usurper's need. No proof was offered, then or ever. The document itself, with a kind of brazen vagueness, said only that the sorcery would be proved if the case required it, which is the language of slander that knows it cannot be substantiated. It was useful lie, nothing more, the resurrection of a discredited charge, because it served to blacken the marriage and bastardize the children, and so to clear Richard's path to the throne. Jacquetta was years dead by then, and beyond all reach of harm, but there is something peculiarly bitter in seeing the lie she had faced down in life carved into the official record after her death, repeated as the common report of the people, to serve the ambition of a man who needed her daughter's marriage to be a matter of witchcraft. The charge that had been thrown out by a council while she lived was written into history once she could no longer answer it. A final injustice done to a woman who had been done so many. We should spare a thought for the helplessness of Jacquetta's daughter in the face of this posthumous slander, for Elizabeth, the Queen, could do nothing to clear her dead mother's name when the old charge was revived against it. By the time the accusation was written into the document proclaiming the usurper's title, Jacquetta was dead and Elizabeth herself was in the gravest danger. A widow whose sons had been taken from her, at the mercy of the man who had seized her husband's throne and branded her marriage a thing of witchcraft. She was in no position to defy him, to protest the slander against her mother, to insist on the truth. She could only endure a fallen queen in a perilous world, while the lie was set down in the record to serve the purposes of the man who held all the power. The clearing of her mother's name was a luxury that the helpless widow could not afford. So the slander stood, written into the official record, uncorrected, because the one person who might have wished to correct it was powerless to do so, and because the man who had caused it written had no interest in the truth. It is one of the ways that lies get into history, through the helplessness of those they wrong and the interest of those who tell them, and the charge against Jacquetta is a clear example. A discredited accusation, revived for political use and left standing because no one with the power to challenge it had the interest, and no one with the interest had the power. Only much later, when the passions of the wars had cooled and historians could weigh the matter freely, would the emptiness of the charge be plainly seen and Jacquetta's name be cleared again, this time before the judgment of history. But in her daughter's lifetime, the lie stood unchallenged, a final injustice that the fallen queen was powerless to right, the slandering of a dead mother by a living king set down in the record of the realm. And yet, in the long run, it is not the slander that has lasted, but the blood. For Jacquetta of Luxembourg, the scandalous duchess, the accused witch, became the ancestress of a line of kings, and her descendants sit on thrones to this day. Her daughter Elizabeth, the Queen, had a daughter of her own, another Elizabeth, Elizabeth of York, and that granddaughter married the first king of a new dynasty, Henry Tudor, and joined the Warring Roses in her marriage and her children. Through that union, Jacquetta became the great-grandmother of the most famous of all English kings, Henry VIII, and the ancestress, through the long unrolling of the generations, of every English sovereign who has reigned since the Tudors came to the throne. The fairy blood of Luxembourg, the line that traced itself to a water spirit, ran on into the royal house of England and has never left it. So the woman whose enemies tried to destroy her as a sorceress, whose name was blackened to serve an usurper, became in the end the matriarch of the crown itself. And her blood outlasted all her enemies and flowed down into the centuries. The line of descent that runs from Jacquetta to the thrones of later ages is worth tracing, for it is the final and the most lasting answer to all that her enemies tried to do. Her daughter Elizabeth, the Queen, bore King Edward several children, and among them was a daughter, Elizabeth of York, a princess of the House of York. When the wars at last ended and a new king, Henry Tudor, took the throne, it was this granddaughter of Jacquetta whom he married, deliberately joining the rival houses of Lancaster and York in his own marriage and in the children it produced, healing the long dynastic wound by uniting the two bloodlines. Through that marriage, Jacquetta's blood passed into the new royal house, the House of Tudor, and ran on from there. The marriage of Jacquetta's granddaughter to the first Tudor king carried a meaning beyond the merely dynastic, for it was understood, then and after, as the healing of the long division that had torn England apart. The two warring houses, the Red Rose of Lancaster and the White Rose of York, were joined in that marriage and in the children it produced. The rival bloodlines united at last in a single line that could claim the loyalty of both. It was a union laden with symbol. The ending of the wars made flesh in a marriage, the two roses combined, and it was celebrated as such. The long quarrel resolved, not by the victory of one house over the other, but by their joining in the persons of the king and his queen, Jacquetta's granddaughter. So Jacquetta's blood was not merely carried into the new royal house, but was part of the very symbol of the kingdom's healing, for her granddaughter was the York half of the union that ended the wars. The white rose joined to the red. The scandalous Duchess, through her daughter the Queen and her granddaughter the Queen, after, became an ancestress of the line that united the roses and founded the peace. Her blood running in the reconciled royal house that rose from the ashes of the lengthy wars. It is a strange and a fitting destiny for a woman whose own life had been so caught up in the divisions of her age, tossed from Lancaster to York by the turns of fortune, that her descendants should be the very means by which those divisions were at last healed and the warring houses joined in one. Their son was Henry VIII, the most famous of all English kings, Jacquetta's great-grandson, and from him and his line the descent continues down through the generations that followed, through the later dynasties, to the royal family of our own day. Every sovereign of England since the founding of the Tudor house has been, in this sense, a descendant of Jacquetta of Luxembourg, the scandalous Duchess, the accused witch, so that her blood, far from being extinguished by her enemies, became the blood of the crown itself and has flowed in it ever since. The fairy line of Luxembourg, the descent her foes tried to turn into a charge of sorcery, ran on into the royal house of England and has never left it. It is the final irony of her story, that the woman they tried to destroy as a worker of dark arts became the ancestress of kings, and that her true legacy was not the slander written against her, but the long line of sovereigns who carry her blood down to the present age. When we look back across the whole of Jacquetta's life, what stays with us, I think, is the boldness of it, and the strange shape of a life lived at the very heights, and yet driven, twice, by the heart rather than by policy. She was born to the front rank of Europe, and raised to the summit of England, and she might have lived out a grand lady's life entirely within the rules, marrying as she was bid, and standing on her rank. Instead, she gambled it all, once for love of a handsome knight, and once standing witness as her daughter gambled in turn. And she lived to see that double boldness raise her blood to the throne, and then expose her to the cruelest of charges. She knew the heights of the court and the terror of the cell, the triumph of a daughter made queen, and the grief of a husband and a son struck down, the vindication of her name in life, and the staining of it after death. Through all of it, she endured, a woman of rank and resolve, and by every sign of deep and lasting love, who followed her own heart through one of the most dangerous ages in English history, and came, in the end, to be the mother of a royal line. The histories have mostly forgotten her, or remembered her only as a name attached to her famous daughter, but her own life was the larger and the stranger of the two. It is worth asking why so remarkable a woman has been so largely forgotten, remembered when she is remembered at all only as the mother of her famous daughter. And the answer tells us something about how history has been written. For centuries, the story of these wars was told as a tale of kings and battles and mighty lords, a story of men in which women appeared, if at all, only as wives and mothers and pawns, their own lives passing unexamined. Jacquetta, who held no crown and led no army, fell easily into the background of such a history, a name attached to the more famous names around her, the wife of a duke, the mother of a queen, the grandmother of another queen, rarely considered as a figure in her own right. The records themselves conspired in this, for they noticed her chiefly at the great public moments, her marriages and the accusation and her death, and left the long stretches of her life in shadow, so that even those who wished to know her found little to go on. We do not even know with any certainty what she looked like, for no portrait survives that we can confidently say is hers. And the woman who stood so high has come down to us without a sure face. This is not unusual for a woman of her age, even a great one, for the painting of portraits from life was not yet the common practice it would later become, and the likenesses of the great were often lost or never made. So we are left to imagine her, the daughter of Luxembourg, the Duchess of Bedford, the mother of a queen, without knowing the colour of her hair or the cast of her features, an eminent figure glimpsed only through the words of the records, and not through any certain image of her person. There is something fitting almost in this facelessness, for it is of a piece with the way her whole life has come down to us, in fragments and through the doings of others, the woman herself always a little out of reach. We know the high events of her life, the marriages and the accusation and the rest, but the person who lived them, her voice, her face, her inner thought, remains in shadow to be guessed at rather than known. And yet even through the fragments, a figure emerges, bold and enduring and remarkable, a woman whose actions speak across the centuries even if her face does not. We may not know what she looked like, but we know what she did. And what she did was extraordinary enough that she stands clear before us, faceless and vivid at once, one of the most striking women of her age. And yet when we gather what there is and look at the shape of the whole life, she emerges as one of the most striking figures of her age, a woman whose story has everything: the highest birth, the dazzling marriage, the scandalous love match, the long happy union, the rise to the summit, the terrible fall, the cruel accusation, the vindication, and the blood that triumphed in the end over all her enemies. She is worth remembering for her own sake, not merely as the mother of Elizabeth Woodville, for her own life was the larger and the bolder, the life of a woman who twice defied the rules of her world, and who endured what would have broken many, and who came, through it all, to be the ancestress of a royal line. If this telling has done anything, I hope it has lifted her a little out of the shadow of her famous daughter, and let her stand, for an evening at least, as the remarkable woman she was in her own right. Perhaps the deepest reason her story holds us is that it is, beneath all the high politics and the dynastic drama, a profoundly human story. The story of a woman who twice chose love and loyalty over safety and was made to suffer for the world she helped to make. She chose a husband for her heart against the entire weight of her rank. And she stood by her daughter's even bolder choice, and she paid for both, in the end, with grief and peril and the cruelest of accusations. Through it all, she seems to have kept her courage and her sense of her own worth, enduring the murder of her husband and the charge of sorcery without being broken by them, coming through to vindication and dying at last in her own home among the remnants of her family. It is a story of love and of loss, of boldness and of endurance. The universal things played out on the grand stage of a royal age. And in the end, the things her enemies tried to do to her failed, while the things she built endured, which is its own kind of justice. They tried to destroy her as a witch, and the charge was thrown out. They tried to blacken her name after her death, and history has cleared it. They killed her husband and her son, but they could not undo the marriage she had made for love or the line she had founded. Her blood ran on into the royal house and flows there still, while the malice of her enemies is remembered, if at all, only as the injustice it was. The scandalous duchess, the accused witch, outlasted all of them, not through any dark art, but through the plain endurance of love and life and lineage, and that, I think, is the truth worth carrying away from her story. The quiet triumph of a woman who was wronged in her age and vindicated in the long judgment of time. So let us leave her there, Jacquetta of Luxembourg, Duchess of Bedford, at rest in her unknown grave at Grafton. Her war's over, and her name, whatever her enemies tried to do to it, carried on in the blood of kings. I hope her life has carried you far from your own tonight, into a world of candlelit halls and powerful families and old loyalties, the way these long-buried stories can, when you let them take you. If these evenings are something you would like to find your way back to, you are always welcome to subscribe and to come and live another life on another night. Whenever the dark grows too loud, and you would rather be a few hundred years and a world away, there is no hurry in it. The stories will keep, and so will I. For now, let your thoughts go loose. Let the castles and the candlelight and the proud old names drift apart and dissolve the way the day dissolves when sleep at last comes for it. You do not need to hold on to any of it. Let the great hall fade, and the wars grow distant, and the quiet rise up around you, and let yourself sink down into it, slowly. With nothing left to do, and nowhere left to be, sleep well, stay warm, be kind to the people in your house, and I will see you in the next one. Good night.